She arrived with a trunk full of hope and a name she thought was about to change. Evelyn Harper had spent 4 months writing letters to a man named Gerald Pratt, careful, measured letters about her cooking and her temperament and how she had always wanted land beneath her feet instead of city cobblestones. She had sold her mother's cameo brooch to buy the train ticket west. She had told herself every mile of track behind her that this was the beginning. But when she stepped off the train at Millhaven Station and looked for a man holding a sign with her name on it, what she found instead was a boy no older than 14, holding a folded note, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else on earth. She opened the note. Gerald Pratt's handwriting. She recognized it from months of correspondence. Told her in 11 words that he had married another woman 3 days ago. He wished her well. If you have ever been left behind by someone who promised they would stay, keep watching. Because this story belongs to you. And if this kind of story moves something in you, take 1 second right now to subscribe to this channel and hit that like button. Drop your city or country in the comments. I want to know how far this story has traveled. Don't go anywhere. What happens next will stay with you. The boy held out his palm. He was waiting for a tip. Evelyn stared at him for a long moment, then looked down at the note again, as though the words might rearrange themselves into something more forgiving. They didn't. She folded the paper along its original crease and tucked it into her coat pocket, where it sat against her ribs like a stone. "You can go," she told the boy. He went. The platform was not entirely empty. A station master moved at the far end, dragging a wooden crate. 2 men in work coats stood near the water pump, talking low. A woman in a brown dress collected a parcel from the freight window. None of them looked at Evelyn, and she was grateful for that, because she did not yet know what her face was doing. She sat down on her trunk. It was the only thing she owned. Inside were 2 dresses, a wool blanket that had belonged to her grandmother, a small tin of sewing supplies, a book of poems she had stopped reading 2 years ago, and 43 cents. She was in Millhaven, Kansas. She did not know a single soul in Millhaven, Kansas. The wind came off the flatland in a way she had not experienced in Philadelphia. It didn't gust so much as press, a steady, indifferent weight that moved through her coat as though the coat wasn't there. She pulled her collar tighter and looked down the main street. She could see a dry goods store, a livery, a building that might have been a hotel, though the sign was too weathered to read from here, a church, a saloon with its door propped open. She thought about what she had told her cousin Beatrice before leaving. "It's a new chapter, Bea. A real one." Beatrice had cried. Evelyn had not, because she'd been too busy believing it. The station master was watching her now. She stood up, straightened her back, and walked to the freight window with as much composure as she had left. "Excuse me," she said, "is there a boarding house in town?" The man at the window, heavy-set, with a mustache that needed attention, looked at her bag and then at her face. "Mrs. Garrity keeps rooms on Holden Street, $1.50 a week." $1.50. She had 43 cents. "Thank you," she said. She walked back to her trunk and sat down again. The sun was already lower than she expected. She had been so certain that by this hour she would be in someone's wagon, moving toward someone's land, with a future arranged neatly ahead of her. Instead, she was watching the light go orange over a town she'd never heard of 6 months ago, trying to count backward through every decision that had brought her here. Her mother had died in February. The apartment in Philadelphia had been her mother's, and the landlord had given Evelyn 30 days. She had no siblings. Her father had been gone since she was 9. She worked as a seamstress, but the shop had let 2 girls go in January, and she was one of them. She'd answered Gerald Pratt's advertisement in a women's periodical because it was the most concrete option in front of her. The advertisement had described him as a God-fearing man of 38 with 200 acres and a desire for a steady partner. She had written. He had written back. After 4 months, she had believed him. She should not have believed him. She was 31 years old and sitting on a trunk in Kansas, and she had 43 cents, and she knew now that she had been trying to solve a problem, the problem of her life, by attaching herself to a stranger's solution. And the stranger had moved on without her. She did not cry. She had already used up most of her crying on the train, somewhere in Ohio, in the privacy of a sleeping car she'd shared with a woman who snored and never once woke to notice Evelyn weeping quietly into her blanket. By the time she reached Kansas, she'd been hollowed out. What was left felt very much like anger, and anger, at least, was something she could use. She stood up and picked up her suitcase, the smaller bag, not the trunk. She left the trunk where it was because she couldn't carry it, and because she didn't have anywhere to take it. She was going to walk into that town and figure something out. She did not know what. But sitting on a platform waiting for a rescue that was not coming was the one thing she absolutely refused to do. She made it as far as the corner of the main street before she had to stop and acknowledge that she had no idea what she was going to do. The saloon was to her left. The dry goods store was closed. A wagon moved slowly down the center of the road, driven by an older man who glanced at her and then glanced away. A dog crossed from one side of the street to the other with the confidence of someone who owned the place. Evelyn stood at the corner and thought very clearly, I cannot afford to eat tonight. That was the thought that finally cracked her open a little. Not Gerald's note, not the empty platform, not the wind or the 43 cents or the fact that she didn't have a room. It was the arithmetic. She had ridden west on the assumption that supper would be waiting, and instead she was doing arithmetic on a street corner in a town that didn't know her name. She pressed her thumbnail into her palm, a habit she'd had since girlhood, something to press against when emotion threatened to embarrass her, and she breathed in through her nose. Then she noticed the wagon that had stopped near the feed store. It was a working wagon, nothing special. A flatbed with some bags of grain and a wooden crate and a coil of rope. What caught her attention was the child. A girl, maybe 7 or 8, sitting up on the bench seat, watching Evelyn with the kind of direct, unself-conscious stare that only children and cats manage without shame. The girl had dark hair coming loose from 2 braids and a smear of something on her left cheek, and she was eating a biscuit that looked better than anything Evelyn had eaten since Missouri. Their eyes met. The girl did not look away. She tilted her head slightly, still chewing, and then held out the second half of her biscuit. Evelyn almost laughed. It caught in her throat and came out as something between a breath and a sound she couldn't name. Maisie. The man's voice came from inside the feed store. Low, tired, the voice of someone who'd said that name 1,000 times. Don't bother people. I'm not bothering, the girl said, without taking her eyes off Evelyn. She looks hungry. The man appeared in the doorway. He was perhaps 35, lean in the way working men get lean, with dark eyes and a jaw that needed shaving 3 days ago. He looked at Evelyn the way the station master had, taking inventory, but less obviously. She bother you? He asked. No, Evelyn said. She offered me a biscuit. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the shadow of one. She does that. He came down the single step from the feed store. You just come in on the afternoon train? There was no point in lying. Half the town had probably seen her sitting on her trunk. Yes. He waited, and when she didn't say more, he didn't push. He just looked at her with those dark eyes, and then looked at his daughter, and then looked at Evelyn's bag. You got somewhere to be? He asked. It was a plain question. He asked it without pity, which she appreciated more than she could have explained. Not yet, she said. He nodded slowly, like this was information he was filing somewhere. Then he said, My name's Caleb Dawson. I've got a ranch about 3 miles east. I was just about to head back. He paused. I'm not offering charity. My daughter's been eating cold biscuits for supper 3 nights running, and I've got a stove that works if someone knows how to use it. Evelyn looked at him. She looked at the girl who had finished the biscuit and was now watching this exchange with keen, bright interest. I know how to use a stove, Evelyn said. Then get in, he said, if you want. It was not a romantic offer. It was not even particularly warm. It was practical in the way everything about this man seemed to be practical, economical, straight, and entirely undecorated with sentiment. Later, Evelyn would think about that moment and understand that it was exactly the kind of offer she had needed. Not a rescue, just an opening. She picked up her bag and climbed into the wagon. Maisie talked for all 3 miles. She talked about the ranch's 2 horses, one named Barley, one named Captain, and Captain was the better one, but Barley didn't know that. She talked about the cat that lived in the barn and had no name because her father said you shouldn't name cats because they'd only leave. She talked about her teacher, Miss Perkins, who was very strict about handwriting but had a nice laugh. She talked about a boy at school named Tommy Garrett, who had thrown a frog at her and she'd thrown it back. And Miss Perkins had been upset with both of them, but more with Tommy because he'd started it, and also because the frog got away and she wasn't sure if it was all right. Caleb said almost nothing. He drove the wagon with his eyes on the road and the particular stillness of a man who'd made his peace with his daughter's monologue. Evelyn answered Maisie's questions when they came. Yes, she was from back east. Yes, she'd been on a train for a long time. No, she'd never seen the Kansas plains before today. Yes, she thought Captain sounded like a good name for a horse. At some point, Maisie reached over and took Evelyn's hand, apparently without any premeditation, just because it was there. She held it for the rest of the ride. Evelyn looked at Caleb. He was watching the road. She looked down at the small hand wrapped around hers and felt something she hadn't felt in so long she'd nearly forgotten what to call it. Safe. Just for a moment. Just that. The ranch was not what she'd imagined from Gerald Pratt's letters. Gerald had described his property in generous terms. A well-built house, solid outbuildings, good land. The Dawson Ranch was solid in the way things that have weathered hard use are solid. Sturdy enough to stand, rough enough to show every hard winter it had survived. The fence needed work on the east side. The porch had a soft board near the door. The garden, what had been a garden, was mostly overtaken now, and she could see the ghost of careful planting beneath the weeds, the evidence of someone who had once tended it. His wife. She knew before she asked. Caleb brought her bag inside without ceremony and showed her where the kitchen was, where the water pump was, where the woodpile was. He did not show her around the rest of the house. He went back out to the barn. Maisie showed her the rest. The house was not dirty, exactly, but it had the quiet disorder of a place where the person who had organized it was gone, and the people who remained were managing without her. Dishes stacked in a pattern that made sense if you were tall enough to reach the shelf. Clothing mended with the patient incompetence of a man who knew seams were supposed to hold, but wasn't sure how to make them. A pair of small boots by the door with the laces knotted too tight, which meant Maisie had tied them herself and done it the way children do when no one teaches them differently. Evelyn found flour. She found salt pork. She found half an onion and some dried beans that she soaked quickly in the only pot big enough and then set aside, because beans took too long. She made cornbread. She sliced the salt pork thin and fried it fast, and she cut the half onion fine and cooked it down in the drippings until it was soft and brown, and the whole kitchen smelled like something worth coming inside for. Caleb came back from the barn and stopped in the doorway. He didn't say anything. He looked at the stove, and then at the table where Maisie was sitting with her arithmetic slate, and then at Evelyn. "Sit down," she said, because she needed to say something, and that seemed like the right thing. He sat down. Supper was not elegant. The cornbread was slightly too dense. She hadn't judged the heat of the stove correctly yet, and the salt pork was just barely the right side of tough. But Maisie ate with the focused pleasure of someone who had been waiting for this without knowing it, scraping her plate twice. Caleb ate without comment, but he ate everything, which told her more than comment would have. When Maisie had been sent to wash her face and get to bed, Caleb poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of Evelyn without asking if she wanted it. She wrapped her hands around the cup. Outside, the wind was picking up, rattling the window in its frame. "You going to tell me what happened?" he asked. She looked at him across the table. She was tired enough that she didn't want to perform anything. She was tired enough that the truth seemed easier than any other option. "I came here to marry a man named Gerald Pratt," she said. "He sent for me. We wrote letters for 4 months. I sold what I had to buy the ticket." She looked at her coffee cup. "He married someone else 3 days ago. He sent a note with a boy at the station." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "A boy?" he said. 14, maybe. He wanted a tip." Caleb's jaw moved once, like he was chewing on something that wasn't food. "Pratt," he said. "Gerald Pratt. He's got a place about 10 miles south." "Yes. I know him." He said it without elaboration. Evelyn waited. "He does things that way," Caleb said finally. "The easy way." She supposed that was generous of him, not to say more. "I don't have anywhere to go," she said. She put it plainly, without apology and without drama, because she was past both. "I don't have money for a room. I don't have family here. I have a trunk at the station and 43 cents, and I can cook and sew, and I'm not afraid of hard work." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not looking for a wife," he said. It came out flat and final, but not unkind. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not offering to be one," she said, just as flat. "I'm offering to work. For room and board until I can figure out what comes next." He turned his coffee cup in his hands, thinking. There's a small room off the back, he said. It's not much, it's been storage mostly. I've slept in smaller. People in town will talk. People in town already watched me sit on my trunk for an hour, she said. They can talk about that instead. Something crossed his face, that almost smile again, there and then gone. One night, he said, we'll talk more in the morning. One night, she thought. All right. She washed the dishes before she went to bed because she was not a guest. Guests waited to be served. She was something else, something without a clean name yet, but she knew the difference between the two, and the difference mattered to her. The morning told her things the evening hadn't. She was awake before the sky was properly light, old habit from years of early opening shops and morning shifts. She built the fire back up in the stove, she'd banked it before bed, and started coffee, and went out to the pump to get water, and noticed, while she was outside in the cold quiet, that the east fence was in worse shape than she'd seen from the wagon. 3 posts leaning badly, and a section of wire that had come down entirely and been propped against the post with a rock. She noticed other things. The woodpile was getting low. Not critically, but she could see what critically would look like from here. The chicken coop needed a door latch because the current one was a loop of wire bent around a nail, and a determined fox would have it open in under a minute. The garden, that ghost of careful planting, had onion sets in it still, the tough kind that came back year after year, and she could see the green tips just starting to push through the dirt at the edge of the weeds. She went back inside and made porridge because it stretched further than anything else she could find in the kitchen, and because Maisie needed something hot before school. Caleb came in from the barn before she'd expected him. He stood in the doorway in his coat, looking at the stove and then at her. You didn't have to, he started. I was awake, she said. Sit down. He sat down. She noticed he didn't argue the second time she said it. Maisie came in with her hair undone and her boots already on, backwards, and sat down and started eating before she said good morning to either of them. Caleb reached over without looking and turned her bootlaces loose. Miss Perkins is doing the spelling contest today, Maisie announced between spoonfuls. I already know all the words. All of them? Caleb asked. All the ones that matter. What does that mean? It means I know the hard ones, and Tommy Garrett doesn't, and those are the ones that matter. Evelyn kept her face neutral, but it was work. After Maisie had gone, running because she ran everywhere, Caleb poured a second cup of coffee and sat back down at the table with it. He looked at Evelyn in that direct, assessing way he had. The room is yours, he said, for now, until you've got a better option. She looked at him. I saw the fence, she said. He blinked. The east section. The wire's down, and the chicken coop needs a proper latch before something gets in. He was quiet for a moment. I've been meaning to get to the fence. I can't fix fence wire, she said, but I can tell you where the problems are, and I noticed you've got onion sets coming up under the weeds in the garden. My wife planted those, he said, 3 years ago. The air in the kitchen changed very slightly, the way it does when something real is said out loud. They kept coming back, he said. I don't know why I never pulled them. Because they're good onions, Evelyn said simply, without turning it into anything more than what it was. He looked at his coffee cup. Clara, he said. Her name was Clara. She died 2 winters back. Fever. Evelyn didn't say she was sorry. It seemed too thin for 2 winters of managing alone with a child and a ranch. She said, she kept a good garden, because that was true and she meant it, and he seemed to understand that she was paying attention to what he'd actually told her. He nodded once, slow. The room is yours, he said again. Oh. The room off the back of the house was, as he had promised, not much. It had a small window that faced south and got afternoon light, a narrow bed with a ticking mattress that sagged in the middle and smelled of dust, a crate that served as a dresser, no mirror, no hook for hanging clothes, though there was a nail in the wall where a hook had once been. Evelyn stood in the doorway of it and thought, I have had worse. Which was true. The rooming house in Philadelphia, after her mother died, had given her a room with a window that looked directly into the neighboring wall, and she'd been able to hear everything through the plaster. She brought her trunk in from the station that afternoon, after walking to town and arranging with the station master to hold it for a wagon pickup. Caleb brought it home without asking why she wanted it and without making her explain herself, which she registered as a point in his favor. She unpacked her grandmother's blanket and put it on the bed. She hung her second dress from the nail in the wall. She set the tin of sewing supplies on the crate and put the book of poems on top of the tin and stood back and looked at the room. It looked like hers. That was unexpected. That was an unexpected feeling. She stood with it for a moment and then went back to the kitchen to start supper, because feeling things was fine, but supper still needed cooking. That first week had a particular quality to it that Evelyn recognized from other hard transitions, the quality of being too busy to properly feel any of it. She helped Maisie with her readings before school in the mornings, because Maisie was strong at figures and uneven at letters, and did not like admitting weakness, but would tolerate being helped if it was framed as something other than help. She reorganized the pantry so that the things used most were at the front. She mended 4 shirts, a pair of work trousers, and a coat sleeve that had parted at the elbow. She scrubbed the kitchen floor on her hands and knees and discovered, underneath the year's accumulation, that it was actually a good floor, solid pine planks, still true. She went to bed tired each night and slept heavily and woke before dawn each morning, and there was something in that rhythm that steadied her, the way hard repetition can steady you when nothing else will. On the 4th day, Maisie came home from school and said, without preamble, "Mrs. Hollis told her husband you're living here, and he told my father at the feed store that it doesn't look right." Caleb, who was washing his hands at the basin, did not look up. "And what did you tell Mrs. Hollis?" Evelyn asked. Maisie considered this. "I told her you make better cornbread than her, and she should worry about her own house." Evelyn pressed her lips together. That wasn't very kind. She wasn't being kind either. This was true. Evelyn looked at Caleb. He was drying his hands with a rag and his expression was carefully neutral. "People will talk," he said, echoing what he'd told her that first night. "I know," she said. "You'll have to decide if that matters to you." She thought about the trunk, the train, the 11 words in Gerald Pratt's handwriting, the 43 cents. "What people say about me," she said, "doesn't change what I know about myself." He looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said, and that was all. She was in the garden on the 9th day, pulling weeds from around those persistent onion sets, when she heard a horse coming up the road fast. Too fast for a working pace. She sat back on her heels and watched the rider, and something in the speed of him made her stomach tighten before she knew why. She recognized the horse before the man. A gray with a white blaze. She'd seen it once, in a drawing in a letter, sketched in the margin by way of introduction. This is Soldier. He is very disagreeable, but very fast. Gerald Pratt. He pulled up at the fence, and she stood up slowly, trowel still in her hand, and looked at him. He was not what she had imagined, but they never were. He was in his 40s, florid, with the particular look of a man who was accustomed to being believed. He had a nice coat. "Miss Harper," he said. "Mr. Pratt," she said. "I heard you were out here." He looked at the house, at the garden, at her with the trowel in her hand, and his expression moved through several things very quickly. "I wanted to come and explain." She waited. "Rosalind, my wife. We'd been courting before I placed the advertisement. She came back around and I couldn't." He stopped. "I should have written sooner. I know that." "You wrote," she said, 11 words. He shifted in the saddle. "I wanted to make sure you'd be all right. I spoke to Reverend Gibbs about—" "I'm all right," she said. "You don't need to worry about me." He looked at the house again, then at her. "People are saying you're living here, that you've taken up with Dawson." She kept her voice level. "People can say what they like." "Evelyn." His voice dropped, took on a tone she'd heard men use when they thought lowering their register made things more serious. "This doesn't look well for you. You sent me across the country with a ticket you knew was one way," she said, "and you married another woman 3 days before I arrived. What looked well hasn't had much to do with my situation since then." His face reddened. "There's a stage going back east in 2 weeks," he said. "I'd pay the fare. Out of consideration." She looked at him standing there on his very fast, very disagreeable horse, with his nice coat and his nervous eyes, and she understood something clearly. He wanted her gone. Not out of consideration. He wanted her gone because her presence here was a loose thread, and Gerald Pratt did not like loose threads. "Thank you," she said politely. I'll let you know." She turned back to the garden and went back to pulling weeds. He sat there for another moment. Then she heard Soldier turn and move back down the road, slower this time. She pulled a weed that came up roots and all, leaving a clean hole in the soil. She did not think she would be taking that stage. That night, after Maisie was asleep, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table and wrote a letter. Not to Gerald Pratt. Not to Beatrice. She wrote it to no one, the way she sometimes did when she needed to understand what she actually thought about something, setting the words down plain, without an audience, to see what they looked like. She wrote, "I don't know what I am here. I am not a wife, and not quite a housekeeper, and not a guest. I am something without a name, and the name doesn't matter as much as I thought it would. Maisie can read all her spelling words now. The garden has good onions in it. I fixed the chicken coop latch today with a proper bolt I found in the shed. A fox tried for the hens last night and didn't get them." She folded the letter and held it, and then opened the stove door and put it in the fire. She did not need to keep it. She just needed to know what it said. Outside, the Kansas wind was doing its steady, indifferent work against the walls of the house. And the house was holding, the way things that have weathered enough hard years learn to hold. And Evelyn Harper, who had arrived on this land with 43 cents and a broken arrangement and a heart she was still trying to understand, sat at the kitchen table and listened to it, and felt, not happiness exactly, and not certainty, but something that might, given enough time and enough honest work, become both. She blew out the lamp and went to bed. The fox came back on a Tuesday. Evelyn heard it before she saw it, a low commotion from the direction of the coop just after 4 in the morning, the hens doing that particular panicked thing they did when something was wrong. Not quite a full alarm, but close enough to pull her out of sleep. She was in her boots and out the back door in under a minute, carrying the lantern she'd learned to keep on the crate by her bed for exactly this kind of hour. The fox was working the latch. She stood there in the cold dark for a second, genuinely impressed despite herself. It was a big one, red-brown, with its nose pressed to the bolt she'd installed 6 days ago, pawing at it with a focused intelligence that was almost admirable. The hens were beside themselves. "No," she said, not loudly, just firmly. The fox looked at her. Then it turned and walked into the dark like it had somewhere better to be anyway. She stood outside until the hens settled, which took a while because hens had long memories for being frightened, and she couldn't entirely blame them for that. When she came back inside, Caleb was in the kitchen doorway in his work clothes, which meant he'd already been awake. "Fox," she said, "I heard." He looked at her. "You went out there alone." It was a fox, not a bear. Still. He said it without elaborating, and she understood that it was not quite a rebuke and not quite concern, but somewhere in between, that narrow territory where two people who aren't certain of the rules yet find themselves speaking carefully around things. She put the lantern on the table. "I'll reinforce the latch tomorrow. Add a second one, higher up." He looked at her for a moment in the way he sometimes did, like he was trying to reconcile the person in front of him with the person he'd expected her to be. "Coffee's on," he said, and went back to the barn. She poured herself a cup and stood at the kitchen window watching the sky start to go gray at the edges, and thought that this was becoming a life, the way things become lives, slowly, without announcement, through enough mornings stacked one on top of another. She was not sure what to do with that, so she started breakfast. Go. Maisie had decided, somewhere in the second week, that Evelyn was hers. It was not stated. It was demonstrated, the way children state things, through action, through the specific gravity children apply to people they've decided matter. Maisie saved the seat next to her at the table. Maisie brought things to Evelyn to look at. An interesting rock, a drawing of Captain the horse that was actually quite good, a caterpillar in a jar that Evelyn strongly suggested be returned to the outdoors before it became a problem. Maisie asked Evelyn things she apparently hadn't asked her father, probably because her father's answers were practical, and Evelyn's answers acknowledged the full complicated weight of the question. "Why do people say mean things about other people?" Maisie asked one evening, while Evelyn was teaching her to hem a dish towel, a skill Maisie had no interest in but was tolerating out of what appeared to be loyalty. Evelyn kept her eyes on her own stitching. "What kind of mean things?" Maisie was quiet for a moment. "Tommy Garrett said that you're a lady nobody wanted." The needle went in and came out, in and out. "Tommy Garrett is 8 years old," Evelyn said. "He heard it from someone." "People say things," Evelyn said. when they're scared of something they don't understand. Sometimes they say it as a question and it comes out sounding like a fact. She paused. Was he saying it to be mean, or was he just saying what he heard? Maisie thought about this with the seriousness she brought to most things. Both, maybe. That's usually how it works, Evelyn said. Is it true? Maisie asked. Direct, the way children are when they've decided you can take it. Evelyn set down the dish towel. She looked at Maisie, who was looking back at her with dark eyes that didn't flinch. A man made me a promise and didn't keep it, she said. That's not the same as nobody wanting me. That's just a man who wasn't what he said he was. Maisie took this in. My papa says some people are all coat and no lining, she offered. Evelyn felt something pull at the corner of her mouth. Your papa is right about that. Gerald Pratt has a very nice coat, Maisie said darkly. Evelyn laughed then, a real one, unexpected, and Maisie looked startled by it for a second and then laughed too. And outside the window the evening was coming in long and gold across the Kansas flatland, and the cat that had no name was sitting on the fence post watching something in the grass. And Evelyn thought, here, something is here. I don't know what to call it yet, but it's here. The townswoman came in a delegation on a Thursday morning. There were 3 of them, Mrs. Hollis, who had sent her husband to the feed store with her concerns, a woman named Mrs. Fletcher, who kept the dry goods store with her husband and had a precise mouth that suggested she kept most things with precision, and a younger woman, Mrs. Danforth, who seemed to be present less by conviction than by social obligation, and who spent most of the visit looking slightly apologetic. Evelyn saw them coming up the road from the kitchen window and had exactly enough time to decide she would not hide and would not simper. She opened the door before they knocked. Good morning, she said. Mrs. Hollis was the talker. She had the look of a woman who had organized several things in her life and expected the same organizational standards from everyone around her. She was not unkind, exactly. She was certain, which in Evelyn's experience was sometimes harder to deal with than unkind. Miss Harper, she said, we've come because we're concerned. Come in then, Evelyn said. I have coffee. They came in. They sat at the kitchen table. Evelyn poured coffee. She had learned how to make it exactly the way Caleb liked it, which was strong, and she made it strong for the visitors because she did not have time for weak coffee or weak conversations. Mrs. Hollis folded her hands on the table. You understand how this looks? I understand how you see it, Evelyn said. Tell me what concerns you specifically. Mrs. Fletcher's precise mouth tightened slightly. An unmarried woman living in a widower's home. Working, Evelyn said. An unmarried woman working in a widower's home. His household needed managing. I needed work. It's a practical arrangement. Practical, Mrs. Hollis repeated, and the tone people use when they want to indicate a word is insufficient. Practical, Evelyn said again, pleasantly. Mrs. Danforth looked at her coffee cup. Mr. Dawson is a respected man in this community, Mrs. Fletcher said. His wife was well liked. What are people saying specifically? Evelyn asked. A small silence. That it isn't proper, Mrs. Hollis said. I cook, Evelyn said. I mend clothes. I help Maisie with her reading. I fixed the chicken coop latch so the fox couldn't get in. I pulled the weeds from around Clara Dawson's onion sets so they could grow properly. She paused. Is there something improper in any of that? Another silence, different in quality from the first. Mrs. Danforth looked up from her coffee cup. Those onion sets are coming up beautifully, she said, and then looked as surprised as anyone that she'd said it. Mrs. Hollis gave her a brief look. The concern, she said more carefully, is about appearances, about what Maisie might come to believe is normal. She's at an impressionable age. Evelyn thought about Maisie, who had told Tommy Garrett to his face that Gerald Pratt was all coat and no lining, who could already read more smoothly than half the adults in town, who brought Evelyn interesting rocks and saved her the seat at the table. Maisie is learning, Evelyn said, that when you're in difficulty, capable women help each other, and people who care about a household take care of it. I hope that's what she'll remember. Mrs. Fletcher looked at her for a long moment, assessing. You're not planning to leave, she said. It was not quite a question. I don't have anywhere to be that's better than here, Evelyn said honestly. The 3 women exchanged a look that had a whole conversation in it. Then Mrs. Hollis picked up her coffee cup and drank from it, and Mrs. Fletcher did the same, and Mrs. Danforth relaxed almost imperceptibly. They stayed for 40 minutes. By the end of it, Mrs. Hollis had given Evelyn a recipe for apple cake that she said was the only apple cake worth making in the county. And Mrs. Fletcher had mentioned, in a tone of pointed casualness, that the schoolhouse needed new curtains and that whoever had the time to sew them would be doing the community a service. After they left, Evelyn stood at the window and watched them go down the road. She had not won them over, but she had not lost either. In her experience, not losing was sometimes all you could manage, and it was enough. She went to town the following Saturday to measure the schoolhouse windows, because she was not going to let Mrs. Fletcher's pointed casualness go to waste. She measured. She bought fabric, blue cotton, modest, practical, with money she'd earned, because Caleb had started paying her a small weekly wage that she'd initially refused, and he'd refused her refusal with such calm finality that she'd accepted. At the dry goods counter, while she was waiting for the fabric to be cut, she became aware of two men talking near the door. She wasn't trying to listen. She heard her name. Pratt saying she ran out on him with money before she came here. She went very still. "No," the second man said. "Seemed decent enough when I—" Pratt says she took cash from the household account before she left East, said he'd sent her money for travel, and she took more than she was owed. Mrs. Fletcher, behind the counter, had stopped cutting the fabric. Evelyn set both hands flat on the counter. She breathed in, slowly, through her nose. "How much fabric did you say?" Mrs. Fletcher asked her quietly. 3 yards, Evelyn said. Her voice came out even. She was grateful for that. She paid. She took her package. She walked out of the store. She stood on the boardwalk outside and looked at the street and thought about Gerald Pratt on his fast gray horse with his nice coat telling her she should take the stage east out of consideration. She understood now what kind of consideration it was. He wasn't worried about her well-being. He was covering himself. He told a story about her before she could tell one about him, and he'd made it a money story, the kind that was simple and ugly and easy to believe because everybody understood money and nobody liked a thief. She stood there until her breathing was regular. Then she walked back to the wagon, put the fabric in, and drove home. Caleb was fixing the fence when she got back. She could see him out on the east side, working the wire with a pair of pliers, his back to her. She unhitched the horse and put the fabric inside and then walked out to where he was. He looked up. She told him. She told him plainly, without decoration, what she'd heard at the dry goods store. She watched his face while she spoke. He didn't interrupt. He didn't look away from her. When she finished, he put the pliers down on the fence post and looked at the horizon for a moment. "Is it true?" he asked. It was the right question. It was the only question, and she was glad he asked it straight. "No," she said. "All right," he said. She waited. "That's all?" "I've known Gerald Pratt for 6 years," Caleb said. "I know what kind of man he is." He picked the pliers back up. "I also know what kind of woman you are. 3 weeks isn't 6 years, but some things you can see clearly enough." He turned back to the fence wire. "Did anyone believe him?" "I don't know yet," she said. "Mrs. Fletcher heard it." "Lydia Fletcher has good judgment," he said. "She'll work it out." Evelyn stood there in the wind, looking at the side of his face. "You're not worried," she said. He glanced at her. "I didn't say that. I said I know what kind of woman you are." He paused. "Worrying about what Pratt's saying and knowing who you are, those can both be true at the same time." She looked at the fence he was repairing, the wire running taut and true between the posts. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me for believing you," he said. "That's just basic sense." She walked back to the house and stood in the kitchen for a minute before she did anything else because something in her chest was doing something complicated, and she needed a moment with it before she went back to work. The rumor moved through Millhaven the way rumors do in small places. Not quickly, exactly, but thoroughly. By the following week, she could feel it in the quality of certain silences when she came into the general store. A longer pause before a greeting. An eye that slid away. Mrs. Hollis stopped her on the street and said, low and direct, "I've heard what's being said. I don't believe it." Evelyn looked at her. "Why not?" "Because a thief doesn't fix chicken coops," Mrs. Hollis said, with a pragmatism Evelyn found unexpectedly touching. But not everyone was Mrs. Hollis. The Reverend's wife made a point of crossing the street. Two women she'd been starting to know at the market stopped their conversation when she approached and picked it back up in a different direction. A man she didn't know looked at her outside the feed store with an expression she recognized, the expression people wear when they've decided something about you and are waiting to see if you'll confirm it. She sewed the schoolhouse curtains. She hung them herself, standing on a ladder in the empty classroom on a Friday afternoon, and they fit the windows cleanly and they were the right blue. She came home and found Maisie sitting on the porch steps, elbows on her knees, mouth set. "What happened?" Evelyn asked. "Miss Perkins said I had to be a monitor at recess instead of playing because Tommy Garrett told her I pushed him," Maisie said. "I didn't push him. I told him to take back what he said and he said no, and I took his hat." Evelyn sat down on the step beside her. "What did he say that you wanted him to take back?" Maisie's jaw was tight. "He said you stole money from Mr. Pratt." The afternoon light was long and dusty on the road. "And you took his hat," Evelyn said. "I gave it back," Maisie said, with dignity. "After Miss Perkins said I had to." Evelyn looked at the road. She thought about the right thing to say, which was not always the first thing you wanted to say. "You know you shouldn't take people's hats," she said. "I know," Maisie said, "but I'm glad you stood up for what you thought was true." Maisie looked at her sideways. "Did you steal money from Mr. Pratt?" "No," Evelyn said. "I knew it," Maisie said, with the absolute certainty of someone who has never doubted this for a second. "I told Tommy that." "You can't know something just because you believe it," Evelyn said, because she believed the girl deserved the full version. "You believed it because you trust me. That's different from proof." Maisie considered this. "Do you have proof?" "Not the kind that shuts people up," Evelyn said. "Not yet." Maisie was quiet. Then, "Papa will figure it out?" Maybe, Evelyn said. "He always figures things out," Maisie said. "He just takes a while because he thinks a lot first." Evelyn looked at the barn door, which was open, and could see Caleb's shape moving inside, slow and methodical, the way he did everything. "I've noticed that," she said. What she hadn't noticed, because she was occupied with other things, was that Caleb had already started asking questions. She found out from the station master, of all people, a man named Eli Croft, who had apparently decided she was worth talking to, maybe because she'd treated him decently that first terrible day on the platform, or maybe just because he had information he thought she should have. He stopped her wagon on a Wednesday morning when she was coming back from town. "Miss Harper," he said, "you know Caleb Dawson's been down at my station?" She pulled up the reins. "I didn't know that." "Came by Monday, looking at the arrival records from the week you came in." He worked something in his cheek. "And the week before, when you were still back east." She understood what that meant. The freight and passenger records would show when she'd arrived, where she'd come from, what she'd brought with her. It would show to anyone who cared to look carefully enough that she had arrived with one trunk and a small bag and nothing else. "Did he find anything useful?" she asked. "Might have," Eli Croft said, with the expression of a man who knew more than he was saying but had decided to stop there. She drove home and went directly to the barn. Caleb was oiling a saddle. He looked up when she came in, read her face, and set the rag down. "Eli Croft told me," she said. "I figured he might," Caleb said. "Why didn't you tell me you were doing that?" He thought about it. "Because I didn't want you to feel like it meant I doubted you. I was looking for the proof you said you didn't have yet." She stood in the barn doorway with the afternoon light behind her and looked at this man who had taken her in off a station platform and fed her and given her a room, and now was quietly gathering evidence for her without saying a word about it. "Caleb," she said. "I'm not finished," he said. "There are freight records and there's a letter the postmaster's been holding. He mentioned it to me last week because he wasn't sure what to do with it. A letter addressed to Gerald Pratt, sent from a bank in Philadelphia." He paused. "Seems like Pratt had financial arrangements back east that he hasn't been entirely honest about around here." She felt something shift in her chest. "What kind of arrangements?" "That's what I'm still working on," he said. "But the records at the station show you arrived with exactly what you said you arrived with. And they show the dates, which means the timeline Pratt's been telling doesn't add up." She sat down on a hay bale because her legs decided that was a reasonable thing to do. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "You're part of this household," he said, simply, like it wasn't a significant thing. "If someone's telling lies about a person in my household, I want to know what the truth is." She looked at her hands. People might say you're only doing it because I know what people might say, he said. I've been listening to it my whole life. What I do and why I do it, that's my business and the people involved. She looked up at him. He was looking at the saddle in his hands, not at her, and his jaw was set in the way it got when he'd said something more than he'd intended, and wasn't going to walk it back. All right, she said quietly. He went back to oiling the saddle. She sat on the hay bale a moment longer, and then stood up and went back to the house to start supper. The cat with no name was on the fence post again, watching the grass. The onions in the garden were coming up in clean green rows, unhurried, doing what they'd been doing every spring for 3 years, stubborn and reliable in the particular way that things left to grow on their own terms tend to be. Gerald Pratt came back on a Thursday. This time he didn't stop at the fence. He rode straight up to the house and tied his horse at the post and knocked on the door with the knock of a man who expected to be answered. Evelyn answered it. He looked different than the first time, less composed, something moving underneath the nice coat surface. His eyes went to her face and then past her into the house, and then back to her face. I want to talk to Dawson, he said. He's in the field, she said. What do you want to talk to him about? This doesn't concern you. She leaned her shoulder against the door frame. Most things that happen on this property concern me. He didn't like that. She could see him processing it, reorganizing something. I heard Caleb's been asking around, he said. About me. Has he? She said. I want it to stop. His voice was lower now, harder, the salesman surface sliding off to show what was underneath. What I said about the money, that was a misunderstanding. I'm willing to call it that. Evelyn looked at him steadily. A misunderstanding. If the questions stop, he said. She understood exactly what he was telling her. He was offering to retract the accusation in exchange for Caleb stopping whatever he'd started finding. The questions that stopped would also stop turning over whatever that Philadelphia bank letter was about. She studied his face. The red in it. The eyes that couldn't quite stay on hers. I'll tell Caleb you came by, she said. Something passed through his expression. Frustration, and underneath it the specific look of a man who realizes the thing he's trying to manage has already gotten larger than he can see. Miss Harper, he said, be smart about this. I'm trying to be, she said, and she closed the door. She stood in the kitchen and listened to his horse leave, and her hands were shaking slightly, which annoyed her. She pressed her thumbnail into her palm once, twice. Old habit. Then she put the kettle on and went to find the tin of sewing supplies and the shirt of Caleb's she'd been meaning to mend at the cuff, because her hands needed something to do and the shirt needed doing. She was still at the kitchen table, working the needle through the cuff seam, when she heard his boots on the porch. She told him what Pratt had said. She told him plainly, the way she told him everything now, without dressing it up or softening it. He sat down across from her and was quiet for a long moment, elbows on the table. He's scared, Caleb said. I know, she said. Scared men do stupid things, he said. I know that too, she said. He looked at the shirt in her hands, then at her face. Something in the way he looked at her. Not pity, not protectiveness exactly, more like recognition. The way you look at someone when you see them clearly for the first time and what you see is better than you expected, made her keep her eyes on the mending. I've got a name, he said. A man named Holt, 2 towns over, who used to work for Pratt's bank account east. Eli knows him. He paused. I'm going to go see him. She kept stitching. When? Tomorrow morning, early. She nodded. The needle went in, came out. Be careful, she said. Always am, he said. She glanced up at him. He almost smiled. Mostly always, he amended. She looked back down at the mending and kept her face steady. And outside the wind moved across the flat Kansas land the way it always did, indifferent to everything, and the house held against it the way it had learned to hold. And Evelyn Harper sat at the table and stitched a cuff and waited for tomorrow, because that was what you did. You did the work in front of you, and you waited for the truth to come in from wherever truth came from. And you trusted that it would get here eventually, because the alternative was giving up, and she had come too far for that. Caleb left before dawn. Evelyn heard him in the kitchen, the particular sounds of a man trying to be quiet, which meant the coffee pot set down too carefully and the boots pulled on one at a time against the floor. She lay in her room and listened and did not get up, because some things a person needed to do without an audience. And leaving early to go find a truth that might undo someone's lie felt like one of them. She heard the horse. She heard it go. She got up and made breakfast for Maisie, who came to the table still half asleep with her braids undone, and ate her porridge without asking where her father was. Because Maisie had learned in 2 winters without her mother that some mornings adults were simply gone and would come back later, and you ate your breakfast and went to school, and they came back. Evelyn braided her hair before she sent her out. Maisie sat still for it in a way she didn't sit still for most things. "You're better at this than Papa," Maisie said. "Your Papa does his best," Evelyn said. "His best is very lumpy," Maisie said. Evelyn fastened the second braid and turned her around by the shoulders and looked at her face. "You know what matters more than good braids?" "What?" "That he does them at all." Maisie considered this with the gravity she brought to everything Evelyn said that she intended to file away. Then she picked up her school bag and went out the door, and Evelyn stood at the window and watched her go down the road, small and straight-backed, and entirely her own person at 8 years old, and felt something that was close to fierce. The day had a waiting quality to it. Evelyn had learned in the weeks she'd been here to read the ranch's silences, the difference between the quiet of a morning going normally and the quiet of something pending. This was the second kind. She felt it in her chest while she worked. She scrubbed the kitchen, mended 2 shirts, spent an hour in the garden pulling the last of the serious weeds from around the onion sets, which were now coming up in proper rows, clean and determined. Clara Dawson's onions. Evelyn pulled carefully around them. At noon, she ate a cold biscuit standing over the kitchen basin and thought about Gerald Pratt and what he was capable of. She knew men like him, not him specifically, but the type. Men who moved through life managing impressions, who understood that reputation was a currency and who spent other people's reputations freely when their own needed padding. Her former employer in Philadelphia had been something like that. A man who kept records impeccably and paid his workers late and always had a reason that made the lateness sound reasonable. Gerald Pratt had a version of the same machinery running in him, she was almost certain. The accusation hadn't been impulsive, it had been prepared. He'd had a story ready before she'd even arrived, which meant he'd known, before she stepped off that train, that he was going to need one. What she didn't know was how far he'd taken it, whether the story was local, a rumor for Millhaven, or whether he'd put it somewhere more official, whether he had people who would speak for him, whether the man 2 towns over that Caleb was going to see would have anything useful, or whether Caleb would come back tonight with nothing but a long ride behind him. She pressed her thumbnail into her palm. Then she went back to work. He came home at dusk. She heard the horse and was in the doorway before he'd finished tying it, and she read his face in the fading light. And what she saw there was not the blank, careful nothing of a man who'd found nothing. It was something else. A held tension, the face of a man who'd found more than he expected and was still working out what to do with it. "Come inside," she said. He came inside. He sat at the table. She poured coffee without asking and put it in front of him and sat down across from him and waited. "The man's name is Holt," Caleb said. "Warren Holt. He worked in the accounts office of a land bank in Wichita, the bank that held Pratt's primary account before he moved operations." He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "He left that job 14 months ago. He didn't leave voluntarily." Evelyn kept her eyes on his face. "He says Pratt was moving money between accounts in a way that didn't match the paperwork. Land purchases that were recorded at one price and completed at another, with the difference going somewhere that wasn't in the ledger. Small enough, each time, that it took Holt 18 months to piece it together." Caleb looked at his coffee. When he brought it to the bank manager, the manager went to Pratt, and 2 days later Holt was let go for reasons that didn't hold water. "Pratt bought the manager," Evelyn said. "Or scared him, one of those." Caleb's jaw worked. "The point is Holt's got records, copies he made before he left. He's been holding on to them because he didn't know what to do with them, and he was afraid of what Pratt might do if he used them." Evelyn sat with this for a moment. "Pratt's been running a land scheme. Looks that way. And he needed money to keep it clean, to fill gaps when the timing didn't work out." He looked up at her. "Holt says there was money that moved through Pratt's account around the time he was corresponding with you. Money from East." She understood what that meant before he finished. "He wasn't sending me travel funds," she said. "He was moving his own money through the arrangement, using the correspondence as a cover for a transfer." "Holt thinks so." He can't prove all of it, but he's got enough to make the question loud. She sat back in her chair. It was almost elegant in a corrupt way. Gerald Pratt had placed the advertisement, corresponded with her for 4 months, sent money east, not for her, or not only for her. And when his actual bride prospect came back around and he no longer needed Evelyn, he'd closed the arrangement and pointed at her. She was perfect for it, a stranger with no connections here, no history, no one to speak for her. If the money question ever surfaced, she was already present as an explanation. "He set me up before I even arrived," she said. "Before you bought your ticket," Caleb said. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the first real dark of evening was settling over the land. "Holt will talk?" she asked. "He's scared," Caleb said. "But he's been sitting on this for over a year and it's wearing on him. I think if someone pushed from the right direction, he'd move." He paused. "There's also the station records. Eli Croft's already got them organized. Dates, what you arrived with, the freight manifest. It shows you came in with 1 trunk and a bag, nothing more, which blows a hole in the story about stolen funds." "That's not proof of anything except what I carried," she said. "No, but it's a start." He looked at her steadily. "I want to take this to Judge Alderman in Hayes. He's not local. He won't have a side already. I know him slightly, from a land dispute 3 years back. He's fair." Evelyn looked at her hands on the table. She thought about what going to a judge meant. It meant making this formal. It meant the story stopped being rumor and became record, which cut both ways. It could clear her name permanently, or it could cement the accusation if Pratt moved first. "If Pratt hears we're going to Hayes before we get there," she said. "I know," Caleb said. "We'd need to move quickly." "We," she said. He met her eyes. "I meant what I said. You're part of this household." She looked at him for a long moment across the kitchen table. This man who had picked her up off a station platform out of nothing more than basic human decency and a daughter who gave her biscuit to strangers, and who had ridden 2 towns over on a long, cold day to find evidence for someone he'd known less than a month. "All right," she said. "When?" "Day after tomorrow. I need 1 day to get Holt's written statement." "I'll write out what I have," she said. "The original letters, the dates, the amounts he claimed he sent." He nodded. "Keep them somewhere he can't get to." "He'd have to come through me to get to them," she said flatly. Something moved across his face. "Yes," he said. He would. She did not sleep well that night. She lay in the narrow bed with her grandmother's blanket pulled up and went over the timeline again and again, the way you go over something when you're trying to find the hole before someone else does. The letters were in the tin with her sewing supplies, all of them, 4 months of careful correspondence. Gerald's handwriting on one side and her own drafts on the other. She'd kept the drafts out of habit and out of a private sense that she might need them someday. She had not imagined needing them quite like this. Around midnight, she got up and moved the tin from the crate to underneath the loose floorboard she'd discovered when she scrubbed the floor on her 3rd day. Not quite a hiding place, just an irregularity she'd noted and remembered. She put the tin there and went back to bed. At some point before dawn, she slept, and when she woke, it was to the sound of Maisie already up and moving around the kitchen. She came out to find Maisie had attempted to make porridge. The attempt was sincere and the result was lumpy and slightly scorched on the bottom. But Maisie had set 3 bowls on the table and was standing over the pot with a look of intense concentration. Evelyn stood in the kitchen doorway. "I wanted to help," Maisie said, without turning around. "You did help," Evelyn said, and meant it. They ate the lumpy porridge. Caleb ate his without comment, which was its own kind of generosity. Maisie watched both of them eat and was satisfied with this in a way that made Evelyn's chest ache a little. The day Caleb went back for Holt's statement, Gerald Pratt came to town. Evelyn didn't see him arrive. She heard about it from Mrs. Danforth, who came to the ranch in the early afternoon with the transparent excuse of returning a borrowed pie dish. Evelyn had sent pie to her family 2 weeks ago, when her husband had been laid up with a bad back, and the actual purpose of telling Evelyn what was happening in town. "He came in this morning," Mrs. Danforth said, in the low, rapid voice of someone passing information they know is important. "He went to see Sheriff Beaumont." Evelyn went still. "What did he tell the sheriff?" "I don't know exactly, but the sheriff was seen going to the station to look at something, and then he came back and went into the land office." She twisted the pie dish in her hands. "My husband heard, from the man who helps at the land office, that Pratt is saying you took money that was meant to establish a joint household, that you cashed a bank draft before you left Philadelphia and kept the funds. Evelyn sat down. There's a bank draft, she said. Pratt says so. She thought hard. Gerald had sent her money, 2 separate payments, through the postal service. The first she'd used entirely for the train ticket. The second, a smaller amount, she'd used for 2 months' advance on the room in Philadelphia while she organized her things before leaving. She had receipts for the ticket. She did not have receipts for the room because she'd paid cash, and Mrs. Weatherly, who kept the rooming house, had not been the receipt-giving type. He made 2 payments, she said, both accounted for. But the second one, I paid cash for a room I was subletting while I packed, and I don't have a record of it. Mrs. Danforth's face did the thing faces do when the news is worse than expected. Pratt's saying the second payment was to establish a household fund, that you agreed to bring it out here and apply it to a joint property, that you kept it instead. There was no such agreement, Evelyn said. There was never any conversation about a household fund. He sent travel money. I used it for travel. Do you have the letters? Yes. Do they say what the money was for? Evelyn thought. She had read those letters so many times she could nearly recite them. Gerald had written, in his 3rd letter, I am enclosing a draft to cover your passage and any necessary arrangements beforehand. I trust you will manage it sensibly. That was all. No mention of a household fund. No restrictions on its use. Just passage and arrangements. The letters say travel money, she said. Nothing more. Mrs. Danforth nodded, but her expression said that the letters were one thing and a sheriff already moving was another. The sheriff's going to come out here, Evelyn said. I think so, Mrs. Danforth said. Maybe tomorrow. After she left, Evelyn sat for a long time. Then she got up and went to the loose floorboard and took out the tin and sat at the kitchen table and went through every letter until she found the one with the money language and read it again, very carefully, and then a 3rd time. I am enclosing a draft to cover your passage and any necessary arrangements beforehand. She put the letter on the table and put her hands flat beside it. Pratt was counting on her not having receipts. He was counting on the language being vague enough to reinterpret. I was counting on being local and known and respected, and on her being the woman from the station platform with nowhere to go and nobody who knew her. She folded the letter along its original creases and put it back in the tin. She was still at the table when she heard Caleb's horse. She met him at the barn door and told him everything before he'd finished unsaddling. His face went through several things while she talked. When she finished, he stood with his hand on the horse's flank and looked at the barn floor. Holt signed a statement, he said. I have it. Will it be enough? For the land scheme? Maybe. For what he's saying about you specifically, he stopped. It complicates it. It's not directly related. I know, she said. He looked up. The letter. Does the wording help you or hurt you? It helps me. But only if someone reads it the way I'm reading it and not the way Pratt's reading it. Let me see it, he said. She brought him the letter. He read it twice, standing in the barn in the last of the afternoon light, his lips pressed together. This is a good letter for you, he said. I think so. Alderman will think so. He handed it back. We need to get to Hayes before Beaumont files anything formal. If Pratt puts a formal complaint in front of a local official, it gets harder. How much harder? Hard enough that it matters. He took the horse's saddle off and hung it. We go tomorrow, early, before Beaumont comes out here. Maisie needs to be at school, she said. Mrs. Hollis will take her. He said it without hesitation, like he'd already worked this out on the ride home. I'll stop there tonight and ask her. Evelyn looked at him. You've thought about this. I thought about it the whole way back, he said. After Holt signed the statement and I started riding home, I went through what Pratt was likely to do next, and I thought about each piece of it. He met her eyes. I don't like this kind of thing. I don't like politics and maneuvering and men who move money to hurt people. But I'm not bad at thinking it through when I have to be. She believed that. She had learned to believe it. Thank you, she said, for the second time since she'd known him. He nodded once, and the same thing happened as the first time she'd thanked him. He looked slightly uncomfortable, like gratitude was a coat that didn't fit quite right. Don't, he said. Just be ready at first light. She was ready. They left in the dark, before Millhaven was properly awake. the wagon moving quietly down the road with the horses breathing white into the cold air. Evelyn sat on the bench with the tin on her lap and her good coat on and her hands folded over the tin lid, and she watched the flat dark land open up around them and did not talk, because there was nothing to say yet that the day hadn't already said for her. Caleb drove with his eyes on the road. After a while he said, without looking at her, "Clara used to sing on long drives." She glanced at him. "I'm not going to ask you to sing," he said. "I just thought of it." She looked at the road. "What did she sing?" "Old songs. The kind her mother knew." He paused. "Maisie has her voice. Can't carry a tune but sings loud. Clara was the same way." Evelyn smiled in the dark. "Maisie sang in the kitchen last Tuesday, something about a river." "She makes up words when she doesn't know them," Caleb said. "I know. The river had a horse in it that wore a hat. He made a sound that was close to a laugh, subdued but real. It was not a sound she'd heard from him before, and she filed it away without meaning to." They rode in silence for a while after that, but it was the kind of silence that had settled into something easier, the way silence between two people changes when they've said enough real things to each other that quiet doesn't feel like distance anymore. Judge Alderman was a compact, gray-haired man with wire-rimmed glasses and the manner of someone who had seen most of the ways human beings found to make each other's lives difficult, and was no longer surprised by any of them. He received them in his office in Hayes with a courtesy that was professional rather than warm, and he listened to everything without interrupting, which Evelyn found, in her experience, was either the sign of a good listener or a man who'd already made up his mind. With Alderman, she thought it was the first. She presented the letters. He read them. He read Holt's statement. He looked at the freight manifest Eli Croft had prepared. Then he took off his glasses and cleaned them with a pocket cloth, which seemed to be what he did while he thought. "Mr. Holt's statement," he said, "pertains to a financial irregularity substantially larger than what's being alleged against Miss Harper. You understand that these are related but separate matters." "I understand that," Caleb said. "The station records show Miss Harper arrived with what she says she arrived with. The letter from Mr. Pratt uses language that is, at minimum, ambiguous about the intended purpose of the funds." He put his glasses back on. "And Mr. Holt's testimony suggests a pattern in which Mr. Pratt has previously used financial arrangements to obscure the movement of money and has previously attributed financial discrepancies to others." "Yes," Evelyn said. Alderman looked at her over his glasses. "You understand that formalizing this creates a record that works both ways. If the evidence doesn't fully hold together, a formal proceeding could do you more harm than the current rumor." "I understand that," she said. "But if I let the rumor stand, it becomes the record. And Gerald Pratt already went to the sheriff in Millhaven." Alderman absorbed this. "Yesterday afternoon," Caleb said. "We came this morning before anything formal was filed locally." The judge looked at the papers on his desk. "I'll need Holt here in person," he said, "and I'll send a written inquiry to the Wichita Bank requesting records for the period in question. This will take time, a week, perhaps 2. He looked at Evelyn. "In the meantime, I'll send word to Sheriff Beaumont that the matter is under review by this court, which should prevent any formal local action while I gather information." Evelyn felt something loosen in her chest. Not relief, not yet, but the particular release of a thing that has been held very tightly for a long time being set down briefly. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," Alderman said. "Thank me when it's finished." He looked at the papers again. "Mr. Pratt is known to me in a general way, not as a criminal, as a man who makes transactions." He paused. "Those are not always the same thing, but they are sometimes." They drove home in the late afternoon. The land was golden in the low light, the way Kansas went golden in that particular hour. All the flatness of it turned somehow generous by the angle of the sun. Evelyn sat on the bench and watched it and felt the complex interior of a day that had taken more out of her than she wanted to admit. "How are you?" Caleb asked. She looked at him. He was watching the road, but the question had not been asked at the road. "Tired," she said, "but better than this morning." He nodded. "Alderman's good. If the evidence holds—" "I know," she said. "I know it might not be enough. I know Pratt might find a way around it." She looked at her hands. "But someone official looked at the letters and the records and said the word ambiguous about his version, and that's more than I had yesterday." It is, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Caleb? Yeah. Why are you doing this? She asked it simply, the way she'd learned to ask him things, directly, without dressing it up. You could have let me go when Pratt first started talking. You could have said it wasn't your problem. No one would have blamed you. And the land went past on both sides. Clara used to say I had a problem with letting things go wrong when they didn't have to, he said finally. Said I couldn't walk past a crooked fence post without wanting to fix it. That's not an answer, she said. No, he said. I know. He paused. I trusted you when you sat down at my table. I trusted you before that. When you climbed into the wagon. Something in the way you got in. You didn't ask for more than you were asking for. You asked for a meal and you said exactly what you had to offer in return, and you meant it. He looked at the road. I've met people who come at you sideways, always asking around what they actually want. You didn't do that, and then I watched you for 3 weeks and nothing changed. He was quiet for a second. When a person's the same in private as they are when they think someone's watching, that means something. Evelyn looked at the road. That might be the most you've ever said to me at once, she said. Probably, he said. She looked at the onion sets in the garden when they got back. Habit now, every time she came up the road, she looked at the garden. They were solid and green in the early dark. Doing well. Clara Dawson's onions, growing for the 4th spring because nobody had been able to pull them. Maisie was at Mrs. Hollis's, and Evelyn went to collect her while Caleb put the horses up. She found Maisie at Mrs. Hollis's kitchen table, being given cookies and apparently in the middle of telling Mrs. Hollis something complicated about Tommy Garrett, who had apparently undergone a partial rehabilitation in Maisie's estimation following an incident with a garter snake that Evelyn decided not to fully inquire into. You're back, Maisie said, he said with profound relief. We're back, Evelyn said. Mrs. Hollis caught Evelyn's eye above Maisie's head and gave her a look that said, I hope it went well. Evelyn gave her a look back that said, well enough. Mrs. Hollis nodded, once, with the brisk efficiency of a woman who communicated a great deal in small gestures. Walking home with Maisie's hand in hers, in the full dark now, the stars coming out over the flat land in their extravagant numbers, Evelyn thought about what Caleb had said in the wagon, about watching her for 3 weeks, about the way she'd got into the wagon. She had not thought, when she climbed up onto that bench with her bag in her lap, that anyone was paying that kind of attention. She had been too busy paying attention to the fact of not having 43 cents and nowhere to sleep. But he had been watching, and what he'd seen had mattered to him. She didn't know what to do with that. She filed it somewhere inside her and kept walking. The week that followed was the longest of her time in Mill Haven. Sheriff Beaumont came out on the 3rd day. He was a quiet man, 50s, with a permanent look of someone who'd rather be doing something else. He sat at the kitchen table and took his hat off and told Evelyn that he'd received word from Judge Alderman's court that the matter was under review and that he wanted her to know he wasn't in the business of rushing ahead of a court that was already working. I want you to understand, he said carefully, that what Pratt told me and what's in those letters aren't exactly the same story. No, she said, they're not. He looked at Caleb. The statement from Holt. Alderman's pulling on that thread. I know, Caleb said. Beaumont put his hat back on. I'll tell you this. The draft Pratt says he sent. I asked him for the bank record. He said he'd get it. It's been 3 days. He stood up. A man who has a record that proves him right usually finds it faster than 3 days. He left. Evelyn sat at the table and let herself feel the specific sensation of things beginning to go the right way, which was different from things having gone right. It was tentative and nervous, and she did not allow herself to trust it entirely. Then the news came in from a direction she hadn't expected. Mrs. Fletcher, precise-mouthed, dry goods counter, Mrs. Fletcher, who had sat in her kitchen with folded hands and asked pointed questions about propriety, sent a note with her young delivery boy. The note said, in Mrs. Fletcher's precise handwriting, I've spoken with my husband's cousin in Wichita, who knows something about the bank in question. I believe you should hear what he has to say. I can arrange it if you're willing. L. Fletcher. Evelyn read the note twice. Then she sat down at the kitchen table and wrote back, Yes. Thank you. E. Harper. She had not expected Lydia Fletcher to be in her corner. She had hoped Mrs. Hollis and been rewarded. Mrs. Danforth she'd half expected. She was a kind woman who'd come to return a pie dish and ended up being something like a friend. But Mrs. Fletcher's precision had always felt like a wall she wasn't entirely sure she'd gotten over. She thought about what Mrs. Hollis had said. A thief doesn't fix chicken coops. People in Millhaven knew her in the small ways now. The curtains at the schoolhouse, the mended shirts, the onion sets, the girl with the better braids. They had formed opinions from evidence rather than from Gerald Pratt's version. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, a great deal. 9 days after they'd gone to Hayes, Alderman sent word. The bank had responded. The record showed that Gerald Pratt had drawn the second draft from an account that contained mixed funds. His personal money combined with what appeared to be deposits from land transactions that were themselves under question. The draft sent east had been logged not as a personal expense, but as a business transaction, categorized under a property account that was connected to a parcel he'd been selling in the territory for the past 2 years. He hadn't sent her travel money from his personal account. He'd moved it through a business account, a land account, and written it off as a property expense, which meant, in the legal arithmetic that Alderman and his court were now working through, that the money had never cleanly belonged to the arrangement with Evelyn at all. It had belonged to a set of transactions that was already being examined. The station records showed what she'd arrived with. Holt's statement showed the pattern. The letter's language showed ambiguity at best, and the bank records showed that the story Gerald Pratt had told about his own money wasn't the story the money told about itself. Caleb read the letter from Alderman's court, while Evelyn stood at the kitchen window, and when he finished reading it, he set it down on the table and was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "It's not over. He'll push back." "I know," she said, "but it's turning." She looked at the garden. The onions. Clara Dawson's onions, standing clean and green in the late spring afternoon. "Yes," she said, "it's turning." She turned from the window and went to start supper, because the children and the ranch and the household did not pause for the turning of things. And she had learned in this life she was building, piece by piece, out of the broken pieces of the one she'd arrived with, that the work in front of you was always the right place to put your hands. The formal hearing was set for a Thursday. Alderman sent word through Sheriff Beaumont, who delivered the notice himself rather than sending the deputy, which Evelyn took as a sign that the sheriff had made up his own mind about something between the day he'd sat at their kitchen table and now. The notice said the hearing would be held in the Hayes courthouse, that Gerald Pratt had been formally summoned, that Warren Holt would be present to give testimony, and that Miss Evelyn Harper was requested to attend with all relevant correspondence and documentation. Caleb read it standing at the door, then handed it to her without comment. She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it with the letters in the tin. "Thursday?" she said. 4 days, he said. Neither of them said what they both understood, that 4 days was time for Gerald Pratt to do something. They had been watching for it, the countermove, the escalation, the thing a cornered man does when he realizes the floor is giving way. Pratt had been quiet since Alderman's court had sent word to Beaumont. Too quiet, in the way that certain silences are not peace but preparation. She found out what he'd been preparing on Monday evening, 2 days before the hearing. Mrs. Danforth came again, and this time there was no pie dish as pretext. She came directly and quickly, and her face when Evelyn opened the door told the story before her mouth did. "He's been to see people," she said, stepping inside without being asked. "Pratt. He's been going around to the families who've bought land from him in the past 3 years, telling them that if his financial dealings come under examination, their purchases might be affected, that titles might be questioned, that they could lose what they paid for." Evelyn sat down slowly. "He's threatening them," she said. "He's warning them," Mrs. Danforth said, with the particular care of someone who understood the legal difference. "He's telling them that they have an interest in his reputation remaining intact." She twisted her hands together. "My husband bought 40 acres from Pratt 2 years ago. It's the east pasture. It's where we run the cattle." Evelyn looked at her. "I'm not here to tell you to stop," Mrs. Danforth said quickly. "I want you to understand that. I'm here because I think you should know what he's doing. Because if people start pulling back, if the witnesses get quiet because they're scared for their land, the hearing falls apart," Evelyn said. "Or gets complicated," Mrs. Danforth said, which is almost the same thing. After she left, Evelyn sat at the table for a long time without moving. The genius of what Pratt had done was that it didn't require direct threat. He hadn't told anyone to stay silent. He had simply reminded them that they had something to lose and let human nature do the rest. Every family in the county who'd bought land from him in the past few years was now doing arithmetic, their land on one side of the scale, Evelyn Harper's reputation on the other. And some of them were going to land on the side of their own 40 acres, because that was what people did when their children needed that pasture. She couldn't blame them. That was the worst of it. She couldn't even fully blame them. Caleb came in from the barn to find her still at the table. He looked at her face and pulled out the chair across from her and sat down without going for coffee first, which told her he understood it was that kind of conversation. She told him. He listened the way he always listened, completely still, eyes on her face, nothing moving in his expression until she was done. When she finished, he said, "Danforth's East Pasture." "Yes." "And the Kellermans. They bought 60 acres from Pratt the spring before last." He rubbed the back of his neck. "The Pikes. The Shaughnessy family south of town." He was running through it in his head. She could see it. The map of who owned what and who'd bought it from whom, and who was now vulnerable to exactly the kind of quiet pressure Pratt was applying. "How many families?" she asked. "In the county? Maybe 8 or 10 who bought from Pratt directly." He put his hands flat on the table. Some of them he sold clean. Some of them, based on what Holt said, might have titles that are messier than they look. He mixed them, Evelyn said, the clean sales and the irregular ones, so that when anyone threatened to examine the irregular ones, the clean buyers got scared too. "Smart," Caleb said, with the grudging recognition of someone who hated what he was admiring. "It's not smart," she said. "It's just cruel. There's a difference." He looked at her. "Cruel takes no particular intelligence," she said. "It just takes not caring who gets hurt." He nodded slowly. "What do you want to do?" She looked at the tin on the table. She thought about the letters inside it. She thought about the station platform and the 11 words and the 43 cents. She thought about Maisie's hand in hers on the walk home in the dark. "I want to go to the hearing," she said. "I want to put the letters in front of Alderman and let Holt say what he knows and let the bank records say what they say." She paused. "If people pull back because they're scared, I understand it. I can't make them not be scared. But I'm not going to let his pressure on them become pressure on me." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said. "Then we go Thursday, and we let Alderman do his job." "There's something else," she said. He waited. "The families who bought clean from Pratt, they shouldn't have to be afraid. If there's a way to separate what Holt knows about the irregular sales from the legitimate purchases and make that clear before Thursday, so they know their land isn't at risk, so they know his threat was empty for most of them," she said, "so they stop weighing their pasture against my name." He thought about this. Alderman could issue a clarification. "Can you get a message to him before Thursday?" "I can ride tomorrow." He paused. "That's a long day." "I know," she said. He looked at her. This expression she'd seen a handful of times now, the one that wasn't quite a smile but was something in the same territory as warmth. "You're thinking about people who are scared for their land while your own name is still under question," he said. "If they're freed up to tell the truth, it helps me," she said practically. "That's not the only reason," he said. She didn't argue it. "No," she said. "It's not." He rode it to Hayes on Tuesday, before first light, and came back after dark, and the message had been received. Alderman understood what Pratt had been doing and sent a written clarification to Sheriff Beaumont to be distributed. The inquiry pertained to specific irregular transactions and would not affect property titles established through legitimate sale. Beaumont distributed it the next morning, which was Wednesday, the day before the hearing. By Wednesday afternoon, 3 things had happened. The Danforths sent word that they would attend the hearing and that Mr. Danforth was willing to speak if it was useful. Eli Croft from the station, who had been gathering his records for weeks with the quiet competence of a man who believed in doing things properly, arrived at the ranch with a second copy of the freight manifest, organized and notarized by his own hand, and gave it to Evelyn with a formality that felt like a gift. And Mrs. Fletcher's husband's cousin from Wichita, the one Mrs. Fletcher had mentioned in her careful note, sent a written statement of his own, detailing a conversation he'd had with Warren Holt 14 months ago, confirming that Holt had raised the financial irregularities with colleagues before being dismissed, which established that Holt's account was not invented after the fact. Evelyn laid all of it out on the kitchen table on Wednesday evening. The letters. Eli's manifest. The Wichita statement, Holt's signed account, the bank records from Alderman's inquiry. Caleb stood on the other side of the table and looked at it. "That's a good table," he said. She looked up. "Of evidence," he said. "It's a good table of evidence." She looked back down at it. It had taken 6 weeks. It had taken a station master who kept careful records, and a woman who returned pie dishes, and a dry goods wife with a precise mouth and a cousin in Wichita. It had taken a man who rode 2 towns over on cold mornings because he believed in straight things and couldn't walk past a crooked fence post. "I'm going to pack this very carefully tonight," she said. "I'll get the wagon ready for first light," he said. She gathered everything up and wrapped it in the cloth she used for good things, a piece of the blue cotton left over from the schoolhouse curtains. And she put it in the tin, and she put the tin in her good bag, and she went to bed and did not sleep for 2 hours, and then slept hard until the dark before dawn. The Hayes Courthouse was a 2-story stone building that had the look of something built to last, which Evelyn found, on this particular morning, to be a quality she appreciated in a building. There were more people in the room than she'd expected. She recognized the Danforths near the back. She recognized a man she didn't know who she thought might be Holt, middle-aged, careful-looking, with the posture of someone who'd been carrying something heavy for a long time. She recognized 2 men who she thought were from the bank, from the formality of their dress. She did not see Gerald Pratt. Caleb noticed it at the same moment she did. He leaned slightly toward her without looking at her and said quietly, "He's here, other side of the door." She looked. She could see through the paned glass of the side door a portion of the hallway, and in the hallway, the back of a coat she recognized. Nice coat. Gray. He was talking to a man she didn't know, a lawyer, from the look of the bag, and from the angle of his shoulders and the set of his head, she could read the quality of the conversation without hearing a word. It was the posture of a man being told something he didn't want to hear and working out his response to it. She turned back to the front of the room and put the blue cloth bundle on the table in front of her and unfolded it carefully. Judge Alderman came in. The room went quiet. He sat. He looked at the room over his glasses, the steady look of a man taking inventory. He looked at the table where Evelyn sat. He looked at the door where Pratt had not yet entered. "Mr. Pratt," he said, to the room generally, in a voice that assumed the message would travel. The side door opened. Gerald Pratt came in. Behind him, the lawyer with the bag. Pratt's face was composed in the way that faces are composed when the composition is deliberate, something actively managed rather than naturally resting. He sat across the room from Evelyn and looked at the front of the room and did not look at her. She looked at him for a moment, then looked at Alderman. It went for 2 hours. Holt testified first. He was nervous in the way honest people are nervous in formal settings. Not because he was hiding something, but because the weight of the room made him feel every word. He spoke carefully and specifically, and when Pratt's lawyer tried to suggest that the records Holt had copied were taken improperly, Holt said, in a steadier voice than he'd used up to that point, "I made those copies because I knew the records would disappear if I didn't. I was right. I checked 2 months after I was dismissed. They weren't in the file." He paused. "I kept them because I thought someone would eventually need them. I was right about that, too." The bank representatives confirmed the account discrepancies. They were precise, technical, and dispassionate in the way that banking men are. And the precision was useful because it didn't allow for interpretation. Numbers said what they said. Eli Croft's manifest showed what it showed. The letters were read aloud by Alderman himself, which Evelyn had not expected. She'd thought he would read them silently. And there was something in hearing them read in the flat, careful voice of a judge that made the language clear in a way that reading them herself never quite had. "I am enclosing a draft to cover your passage and any necessary arrangements beforehand." In Alderman's voice, in this room, the sentence was exactly what it was and nothing else. Pratt's lawyer argued that arrangements was expansive language that could include household establishment funds. Alderman looked at him over his glasses and said, "In the context of the full letter taken with the prior correspondence, the intent appears to be travel-related. If Mr. Pratt intended to establish a property fund through this transfer, that intent does not appear in the written record." Pratt said something to his lawyer in a voice too low to hear. Then Alderman looked at Evelyn. "Miss Harper, I want to ask you directly, for the record. Did you receive any communication from Mr. Pratt, written or verbal, establishing that the funds in question were intended as a joint household account? No, she said. His letters described travel money. There was no other communication about the funds. Did you spend them on travel? The first draft, entirely on the train ticket and the transfer. The second draft, partially on the train ticket remainder and partially on 2 months' advance on the room I was subletting while I packed my things. I paid cash to the rooming house landlady. I don't have a written receipt because she didn't provide them. Do you have the name and location of this landlady? Mrs. Agnes Weatherly, on Crane Street in Philadelphia. She had written it down and put it in the blue cloth bundle because she had thought of it 3 days ago and prepared it. She handed the paper to the clerk. Alderman took it. He looked at Pratt. Pratt's lawyer stood. He gave an argument. It was a competent argument. She acknowledged that. He pointed to the ambiguity of the language. He pointed to the fact that Holt's testimony, however credible, pertained to a separate matter. He pointed to the absence of the receipt. He argued that the formal allegation deserved more than circumstantial exculpation. Alderman listened to all of it. Then he took his glasses off and cleaned them with the pocket cloth. The room was very still. He put his glasses back on. The evidence before me, he said, does not support the allegation that Miss Harper improperly retained funds belonging to Mr. Pratt. The language of the relevant correspondence does not establish the purpose Mr. Pratt has described. The freight and arrival records are consistent with Miss Harper's account. The broader financial picture, which this court will be examining separately and at greater length, suggests a pattern in which Mr. Pratt has previously categorized expenditures in ways that served his accounting interests rather than accurately describing their nature. He looked at Pratt. This court finds no basis for the allegation of financial misconduct against Miss Evelyn Harper. The record will reflect that. He looked at the room. Miss Harper's name, he said, is clear. Wang. She had expected to feel more in that moment. She had expected some larger sensation, relief or triumph, or something that announced itself properly. Instead, what she felt was quieter than that and more complicated. She felt the particular tiredness of someone who has been holding a thing up for weeks and has just been told they can put it down. She felt the strangeness of a long tension resolving. She felt, at the very back of all of it, something small and warm and real, like an ember that had been there the whole time, just waiting for the room to get quiet enough to notice it. Caleb put his hand briefly on her arm, just for a second. Then he moved it. Outside the courthouse, in the thin spring sunshine, people came to her in the way people come to you when a thing has been formally resolved, with the relief of those who hadn't been certain how it would go and were glad it had gone this way. The Danforths, a man she half recognized from the hardware store. Holt, who shook her hand with the grip of someone who understood what it felt like to have told the truth under pressure and been believed. Thank you, she told him. I should have done it sooner, he said. I kept thinking it wasn't my business. He looked at the ground. Turns out it was. She watched him go. She thought there was probably a whole story in Warren Holt, a story about what it cost a man to hold information for 14 months while his dismissed self tried to figure out whether the cost of speaking was worth it. She didn't know that story, but she respected its weight. Gerald Pratt came out of the courthouse with his lawyer, and they walked to the lawyer's wagon and got in without looking at her. Just before the wagon turned, Pratt looked back. She looked at him steadily and said nothing and did nothing because there was nothing left to say and nothing left to do. He had told a story about her, and the story had not held, and now it was part of the record in the Hayes courthouse, the part that said the allegation had no basis. And that was more than enough. The wagon went down the road. She breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth and turned away. On the ride home, Maisie's voice was in her head. Papa will figure it out. He always figures things out. He just takes a while because he thinks a lot first. She looked at Caleb driving the wagon and thought about all the thinking he'd done. The 2 towns over for Holt's statement, the message to aldermen about the landowners. The early mornings and the long rides and the careful, methodical way he'd gone about it. The way he went about everything. No flourish, no announcement, just the work, done properly. What are you going to do? She asked. He glanced at her. About what? Now that this is done. He looked at the road. Fix the north pasture fence. It's been needing it. A pause. The hay needs turning. She almost smiled. I meant, she stopped. He waited. Nothing, she said. The fence sounds right. He didn't push it, and she was grateful because she hadn't been sure what the rest of the sentence was. She was becoming aware, on the long drive back through the Kansas afternoon, of something that had been growing in her peripheral vision for weeks that she had not allowed herself to look at directly, and she was not sure she was ready to look at it directly yet. They were 2 miles from Millhaven when they heard the horse coming up fast behind them. Caleb pulled the wagon to the side without being told, and the rider came past them and then pulled up and turned, and it was Mrs. Hollis, pink in the face, on her mare, which surprised Evelyn considerably because Mrs. Hollis did not strike her as a woman who rode hard for anything she could walk to in a composed manner. I heard it came out right, Mrs. Hollis said, without preamble. It did, Caleb said. She looked at Evelyn. Her expression was doing something complicated. There are people in town who owe you a better welcome than they gave you, she said. I intend to see that they understand that. Evelyn looked at her. You don't need to do that. I know I don't need to, Mrs. Hollis said, with a firmness that closed the subject. I'm going to anyway. She turned her horse. Come to supper Sunday, both of you. Bring the girl. She rode back toward town before either of them could answer. Caleb looked at Evelyn. I suppose we're going to supper Sunday, he said. Apparently, she said. Oh. Maisie took the news with the absoluteness of someone who had never doubted the outcome. I know, she said, when Evelyn told her that evening. I told Tommy Garrett it was going to be fine, and he said maybe, and I said no, definitely, because Evelyn doesn't lie and Papa doesn't give up, so it was definitely going to be fine. She delivered this without looking up from her slate, where she was working on a subtraction problem that appeared to be giving her trouble. Evelyn sat down next to her at the table. What's the trouble? She asked, about the arithmetic. This one keeps coming out wrong, Maisie said. She showed her. The subtraction was right, but she'd carried a number in the wrong column. Evelyn pointed to it. Maisie looked, then made the sound children make when they see their own error, the short, sharp exhale of someone who knows they should have caught it. She erased and did it again. There, Evelyn said. There, Maisie agreed with satisfaction. They sat like that for a while, Maisie working her slate and Evelyn mending a hem that had come down on Maisie's second dress, the one she saved for school. And the kitchen was warm and the stove was doing its work, and outside the last of the daylight was going pink and gold across the land. Caleb came in. He washed his hands. He sat down. He looked at the two of them at the table, and his face did something she'd learned to read, a specific quietness that came over him when he was looking at something that mattered to him, a stillness that was not absence but its opposite. He got up and poured 3 cups of water and put one in front of each of them, because supper wasn't ready yet. It was a small thing. She noted it. She started packing 3 days later. It was not a decision she'd announced. She hadn't talked herself into it or out of it. She simply woke on the 4th morning after the hearing with the knowledge, clear as the dawn light through the south window, that the original arrangement had been temporary, room and board until she had a better option, and that a better option had now technically arrived. Her name was clear. Alderman's ruling was on record. The stage went east every 2 weeks. She was not leaving immediately. She was simply preparing, the way she prepared for everything, quietly, practically, without drama. She washed and folded her second dress and laid it on the crate. She took the book of poems down from the top of the tin and looked at it and put it in the bag. She started a small mental list of what needed to be done before she could go. The shirt of Caleb's she still had to finish at the cuff, the panel in Maisie's dress that had started to give at the side seam. She was going through the tin, checking that all the letters were there, when Maisie came in from school. Maisie stopped in the doorway. She looked at the folded dress on the crate. She looked at the book in the open bag. She looked at Evelyn's face. Children read things. People forgot that. They looked right past the composure and saw the thing behind it. Are you leaving? Maisie said. Evelyn set the tin down. The reason I came here was to figure out what came next, she said carefully. Now that the legal matter is settled, it makes sense to think about what comes next. That's not an answer, Maisie said. Her voice was very flat. It was the voice she used when she was working hard not to use a different voice. I don't have a complete answer yet, Evelyn said. You can't leave, Maisie said. Maisie? Your room is yours, Maisie said. It was always your room. It was never a guest room. I put the nail in the wall for your dress before you came. After Papa said someone was going to stay, I put the nail in myself with a rock because I couldn't find the hammer, and I hit my thumb, but I didn't tell anyone because—" She stopped. Evelyn was very still. "You hit your thumb," she said. "It went purple," Maisie said, with the fury of someone reporting a sacrifice that had been made and should be recognized. "And I didn't say anything because I didn't want Papa to say it wasn't worth the trouble." Evelyn looked at the nail in the wall. She had always assumed it was old. She had thought it was where a hook had once been. She had thought exactly that. She remembered thinking exactly that on the first night. Maisie had put it there, with a rock, with a purple thumb that she'd hidden. Something in Evelyn's chest did something complicated and final, like a door that had been standing open for weeks, finally settling on its hinges. "Come here," she said. Maisie came to her and Evelyn put her arms around her, and Maisie held on with the grip of someone who was not going to let go first, who would outlast anything, who had decided this was hers and meant it completely. She didn't hear Caleb come in. She didn't hear him until he was in the doorway of the room, and when she looked up, he was standing there looking at the folded dress on the crate and the bag on the floor, and his face was doing the controlled nothing thing it did when he was feeling something he hadn't decided what to do with yet. Maisie let go of Evelyn and turned to look at her father. "She's thinking about leaving," Maisie said. He looked at Evelyn. "Maisie," Evelyn said, "can you go feed the chickens for me?" Maisie looked between them. She appeared to calculate something. Then she went, with the dignity of someone making a tactical withdrawal rather than an obedient exit. The room was quiet. Caleb looked at the bag, at the dress, at the nail in the wall, which Evelyn now knew the history of. Then at her. "The arrangement," he said. "You said room and board until you had a better option." "Yes," she said. "Do you have one?" he asked. "A better option." She looked at him. "The stage goes east." "I know when the stage goes," he said. His voice was even, but there was something underneath it. Not quite the controlled nothing now, something with more pressure in it. "Is that what you want? East?" She didn't answer immediately, because she was past the point of answering before she knew what she actually meant. "I don't know what I want," she said. "I came here wanting one thing, and it turned out to be the wrong thing. Then I wanted my name back. I have that now." She paused. "I don't know what I'm supposed to want next." He moved into the room, not quickly, just enough to be closer than the doorway. "You don't have to go," he said. "That's what I want to say. You don't have to leave because the legal thing is resolved." She looked at him. "I'm not running the arrangement because I feel obligated," he said. "I'm not keeping you on out of pity, and I'm not going to pretend this has stayed practical." He said the last word without quite looking at her, the way he spoke when he'd said more than he'd planned and had committed to the rest of it. "You made this house into something it hasn't been in 2 years. You put a second latch on the chicken coop, and you got Maisie's braids straight, and you thought about the families who were scared for their land while your own name was still in question." He stopped. "That's not room and board, that's—" He stopped again. "Caleb," she said. "I'm not asking you to stay because Maisie needs you," he said. "She does. But that's not why I'm asking." The room was very quiet. "You're asking," she said. "Yes," he said. He finally looked at her directly. "I'm asking." She had arrived in this territory with nothing. She had arrived on a platform with a trunk and 43 cents and a broken arrangement and a heart she'd been trying to make sense of for months. She had fixed a chicken coop and pulled weeds from around someone else's onions and sewed curtains for a schoolhouse and driven to Hayes before dawn and put letters in front of a judge and watched a verdict come down that said her name was her own. She had done all of it without certainty about what came after. This was what came after. She looked at this man who drove wagons in silence and fixed fences without announcement and put cups of water in front of people without making anything of it, who had gone to find the truth for her before she'd asked him to, who said what he meant and meant what he said, and sometimes said more than he planned to and didn't walk it back. "I'm not going to be easy," she said. "I have opinions, and I say them, and I'll disagree with you when I think you're wrong." "I know that," he said, not like it was a problem. "And I need to be here because I'm choosing to be here," she said. "Not because I don't have anywhere else. Not because you offered and I needed something. Because I'm choosing it." "That's the only way I'd want you here," he said. She picked up the folded dress from the crate and put it back in the trunk. She unpacked the book of poems and put it back on top of the tin. She looked at the nail in the wall, Maisie's nail, put in with a rock, with a thumb that went purple. And she took her dress off the bag and hung it back on the nail. Caleb stood in the doorway of the room that had always been hers and watched her do it, and he didn't say anything, which was the right thing. "Tell Maisie the chickens can wait," she said finally. "Supper needs starting." He almost smiled. The real version this time, not the shadow of one. "I'll tell her," he said, and went to find his daughter. And Evelyn stood alone for a moment in the small room with the south-facing window, in the last of the afternoon light, and she put her hand flat against the wall beside the nail, just for a second, as if testing whether it was solid. It was solid. She went to start supper. Supper that night was nothing special. Evelyn made salt pork and beans, the long-soaked kind, finally cooked through, and cornbread that came out better than the first time because she'd learned the stove's particular temperament by now, knew which side ran hot, and where to set the pan for an even bake. Maisie ate with the settled satisfaction of someone who had gotten what she wanted without having to fully name it, which was its own kind of victory. Caleb ate without comment. Outside the window, the Kansas evening did its slow thing, the light going from gold to rose to the particular deep blue that came just before full dark. Nobody talked much. That was all right. They had gotten to the point, the three of them, where silence at the table was not absence but presence, the comfortable kind that didn't need filling. After Maisie was in bed, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table with the tin open in front of her. She took out Gerald Pratt's letters one by one and read them, not looking for evidence this time, just reading them the way you read something when it's finally over and you want to understand what it actually was. They were not the letters of a villain. That was the thing she'd come to, slowly, in the weeks since the hearing. They were the letters of a man who was careless with people, who looked at people the way he looked at land, assessing their use, calculating their cost, and moving on when the calculation changed. He had written to her for 4 months with warmth that was real enough in the moment, but had no roots in it, no actual commitment underneath. He had sent money that served double purposes and told himself that was just efficiency. He had abandoned her with 11 words and told himself that was just practicality. The cruelest people in Evelyn's experience were rarely the ones who set out to destroy you. They were the ones who simply never thought about you hard enough to consider what they were doing. She put the letters back in the tin. She did not burn them this time. She put the lid on and set the tin on the crate in her room, in the back corner, and left it there. It belonged to the record of who she was and what had happened to her, and she was done being ashamed of any of it. She went to bed and slept without interruption, straight through to the gray of early morning, and when she woke, she lay for a moment and listened to the house around her. The particular sounds of a structure she knew now, the way it settled, where the board spoke underfoot, how the kitchen fire sounded different from her room than it did from anywhere else. And she felt the specific quality of being exactly where she was supposed to be, which was not something she had felt very many times in her life and which she intended to pay attention to. Quote, Gerald Pratt left Millhaven 6 weeks after the hearing. He did not announce it. He sold his southern property, at a loss from what people said, and settled what he could of the accounts under alderman's scrutiny and disappeared into the territory with the gray horse and the nice coat and whatever was left after the arithmetic worked itself out. The land scheme had not resulted in criminal charges. Alderman's court had determined that the irregularities, while clear, fell into a legal territory that was difficult to prosecute formally without a damaged party willing to press forward, and the families who'd bought from Pratt had mostly decided their titles were intact enough that they'd rather have the matter closed than reopened. Warren Holt, from 2 towns over, was said to have felt something between justice and disappointment about this, which was the feeling most honest people have when the world resolves things at partial credit. Evelyn heard about Pratt's departure from Mrs. Danforth, who heard it from her husband, who heard it from the man at the livery who'd seen the gray horse loaded into a transport wagon on a Tuesday morning. She received this information and sat with it for a minute. Then she said, "I hope the horse is all right. It was a good horse." Mrs. Danforth looked at her. "The man was something else," Evelyn said. "But the horse was innocent." Mrs. Danforth laughed, a genuine one, startled out of her. And then Evelyn laughed too, and it felt like something releasing, like the last of a tension she hadn't known she was still carrying. The summer came in fast and hot the way Kansas summers did, without apology. The ranch changed with it. Caleb hired a hand, a young man named Orrin, 16, from a family south of town, who had more boys than work. And with Orrin's help, the north pasture fence got fixed and the barn roof got patched, and the east section that had been leaning since before Evelyn arrived was finally set right. She watched Caleb show Orrin how to set a fence post, patient, specific, not unkind, and thought about what Maisie had said. He always figures things out. He just takes a while because he thinks a lot first. She was learning to recognize the thinking, the stillness before the action, the way he turned a problem without showing it, the way the answer, when it came, was always quieter than expected. She expanded the garden. She asked Caleb's permission first, which he gave with the expression of a man who knew the asking was a courtesy rather than a genuine request. She pulled the remaining weeds and turned the earth past the onion sets and put in tomatoes, squash, 3 rows of beans, and a long edge of herbs, useful ones, not decorative. And she worked the garden in the early mornings before the heat came on, in the specific peace of a person who has found the right hour for themselves. Clara Dawson's onions grew alongside all of it. Evelyn had decided sometime in spring that she would not pull them. They were part of the garden's history, and the garden was part of the ranch's history, and the ranch's history included a woman she'd never met who had planted things carefully and maintained them until she couldn't, and whose daughter had her voice and her stubbornness and possibly her habit of being absolutely certain about things she had no technical proof of. Evelyn tended Clara's onions the same as her own. It seemed like the right thing, too. Maisie turned 9 in July. They made a cake, Evelyn and Maisie together, which meant Evelyn baked and Maisie supervised with intense, occasionally contradictory opinions about every step. The icing was slightly uneven because Maisie had insisted on doing it herself, and Evelyn had let her, and it was the best cake Evelyn had ever been associated with because of it. Caleb gave Maisie a proper pocket knife, which made Maisie go briefly speechless with joy before recovering and immediately beginning to think of things to carve. Mrs. Hollis came with her husband and brought a new ribbon for Maisie's braids, and stayed for 2 hours and talked to Evelyn about the schoolhouse and whether the community could raise enough to add a second room by fall. The Danforths sent a jar of their honey. Even Mrs. Fletcher appeared briefly, with a small wrapped package that turned out to be a copy of a natural history book, which Maisie received with the pure pleasure of a child who genuinely loved to know things. Evelyn stood at the edge of the porch that evening, watching the last of the birthday afternoon wind down. Maisie on the fence post trying to get the cat with no name to let her carve something near it. Caleb talking to Mr. Hollis about the fall harvest. And she had the sensation she'd had a handful of times now, the one she'd learned to recognize. The feeling of a life that was actually hers, actually real, not borrowed or temporary or contingent on some arrangement holding. She had not planned for this. She had planned for Philadelphia, for a train ticket, for a man who sent letters. None of that had gone according to plan, and the thing that had come from the wreckage of the plan was standing here, on this porch, watching a girl try to convince a cat to hold still. That was worth thinking about. She thought about it. Caleb asked her in August. It was not a grand occasion. They were in the barn, she had come to tell him. Supper was close to ready and found him sitting on the hay bale where she'd once sat down suddenly when her legs decided to, reading a letter that had arrived that afternoon from Alderman's Court, a final disposition of the remaining financial questions. He'd handed it to her without comment, and she'd read it, and it was what they'd expected. The matter formally closed, the record settled. She handed it back. He folded it and put it in his coat pocket and looked at his hands for a moment. "I've been thinking," he said. She waited. She had learned to wait for him. He thought a lot first, and then he said the thing. And the thing was always exactly what he meant, and it was worth the wait. "I've been thinking about the arrangement," he said. "The original one." "It wasn't much of an arrangement," she said. "You said one night, then you said until she had a better option. You stayed past both of those." "I did," she said. He looked up at her. "I want to make a different arrangement. A permanent one." He said it simply, without theater, without the borrowed language of formal occasions. "I want you to stay. Not as a housekeeper. Not as help with Maisie. As the permanent version." He stopped. "I'm not good at this part." "You're doing fine," she said. "I want to marry you," he said. "If you want that. If you're choosing it." He added the last part deliberately. She could hear it, because he had been listening on the day she'd said it, the day she'd unpacked the dress and hung it back on the nail. "I need to be here because I'm choosing to be here." He had remembered. He was giving it back to her. She looked at him on the hay bale in the barn light, this man who was not simple but was honest, who was not easy but was steady, who had never promised her more than he could give, and had consistently given more than he promised. "Yes," she said. "I'm choosing it." He nodded once, slow, the way he absorbed important information. Then he stood up. Then, because neither of them entirely knew what to do with the moment, he said, "Supper's ready?" "Almost," she said. They walked back to the house. They were married in October, on a Saturday, in a ceremony that was plain and short and exactly what both of them wanted. It was not a church wedding. It was held at the ranch, in the yard, with Judge Alderman officiating. Caleb had asked him, and Alderman had come, with the air of a man who found this particular sequel satisfying. Mrs. Hollis organized food, because Mrs. Hollis organized things, and was not going to let an event of this nature happen without proper organization. The Danforths came, and the Fletchers, and Eli Croft from the station, and Orrin the hired hand, who was clearly uncertain about the dress code and had made a sincere effort. A few other families from the surrounding land, people Evelyn had come to know in the ordinary way of communities, through borrowed tools and shared harvests and conversations at the general store. Maisie wore the dress with the repaired side seam and a ribbon in her braids, and stood next to Evelyn during the ceremony with the air of someone who had arranged this entire situation and was satisfied with how it had turned out. Caleb wore his good coat. He had ironed it himself, which she knew because she'd seen him doing it, which she pretended not to have seen because he would have been embarrassed. They stood in the yard in the October light, which was cool and clean and the particular quality of Kansas fall that she had come to love. Honest light, without the summer's intensity, showing things clearly. Alderman read what needed to be read. They said what needed to be said. When it was done, Maisie took both their hands at once, one in each of hers, and stood between them, and didn't say anything, which was unusual enough for her that it said more than words would have. The first hard winter came 2 months after the wedding. It came the way Kansas winters came, without gradual announcement, as if the weather had decided the fall had gone on long enough. 3 days of hard freeze, a week of snow that drifted against the north fence and had to be cleared every morning, livestock that needed extra attention, and a water trough that iced over twice daily. Evelyn learned things about herself that winter. She learned she was better in cold than she'd thought, that the work of a ranch in winter was different from summer, more internal, more about maintenance than growth, and that maintenance suited her. She repaired things through the cold months, not just clothes and equipment, but the smaller repairs of daily life. The routine that kept Maisie doing her schoolwork even when school was suspended for a week of bad weather. The meals that needed to be more substantial than summer meals. The specific management of a household that kept 3 people warm and fed and sane when the world outside the walls was doing its worst. Caleb worked the winter the same way he worked everything, steadily, without complaint, with a thorough attention to what needed doing. There were mornings she woke to find he'd already been out and back and the water trough was cleared and the horses fed, and he was on his second cup of coffee before she'd come out of the bedroom. There were evenings she fell asleep at the table over mending and woke to find a blanket put over her shoulders. The lamp turned low. He did not make a thing of these gestures. That was the point of them, she thought, during those cold months, about what it meant to be chosen by someone who was not romantic about the choosing, who saw you clearly, who knew your impatience and your opinions and your habit of pressing your thumbnail into your palm when you were working not to feel something, and chose you anyway, specifically, not the idea of you. She had spent a long time before Kansas trying to find the place where she fit. She had looked for it in practicality, in arrangements, in advertisements and periodicals, in the logic of matching her skills to someone else's needs. She had thought belonging was something you applied for, something with terms. What she understood now was that belonging wasn't a contract. It wasn't a fair exchange or a practical arrangement or something you earned by being useful enough. It was something that happened between people who kept choosing each other past the point where it was convenient, past the point where the arrangement made obvious sense, past the point of easy exits. Caleb had chosen her when the easiest thing was to let her go. She had chosen to stay when staying wasn't yet safe. Maisie had put a nail in the wall with a rock and a purple thumb before Evelyn had even said yes to supper. That was how belonging actually worked. It was a verb, not a condition. It was something you kept doing. Spring came back with the particular extravagance of things that have been held back too long. The garden came first, or rather, Clara's onions came first, pushing through the half-frozen ground in early March before anything else, the way they always had, stubborn and indifferent to whether the season was ready for them. Evelyn saw them from the kitchen window on a gray Tuesday morning and felt the same thing she'd felt the first time she'd noticed them, that first March. A recognition, a sense of something continuous and reliable in the middle of everything that changed. She was in the garden pulling the first weeds of the year, cold work, the ground still stiff, when Maisie came home from school and came straight out to her without going inside first. "Miss Perkins says there might be a second schoolroom in fall," Maisie announced. "I heard that might happen," Evelyn said, without looking up from the weeding. "She says someone spoke to the county about it." Maisie crouched down next to her, uninvited. "Was that you?" Evelyn pulled a weed. "Mrs. Hollis organized the petition." "But you talked to Mrs. Hollis about it first." "I mentioned it," Evelyn said. Maisie was quiet for a moment, doing the thing she did where she was deciding whether to say the thing she actually meant. Evelyn had learned to wait for this the same way she'd learned to wait for Caleb. "I told Tommy Garrett that you were the reason," Maisie said. "He said his mother said you were pushy." "What do you think?" Evelyn asked. Maisie considered. "I think pushing is the right word when the thing needs to move and nobody else is pushing," she said, with the authority of someone who had worked this out carefully. Evelyn looked at her. This girl with the braids and the absolute certainties and the way she filed things away in that quick, serious mind. This girl who had put a nail in a wall with a rock. "That's a very good way to think about it," she said. Maisie nodded, satisfied. Then she got up and went inside because she had said what she came out to say, and that was that. In June, a letter came from Beatrice, Evelyn's cousin, the one who had cried when Evelyn left Philadelphia, the one she'd told it's a new chapter. Bea, a real one, had written, finally, after months of silence that Evelyn had understood. Beatrice had not approved of the original plan and had said so. And when the plan had collapsed, she had written once with practical concern and then gone quiet, the way people do when they are waiting to see how a story ends before they decide what they think about it. The letter was 3 pages long. It described Beatrice's life in Philadelphia, a new position, a neighborhood she'd moved to, a man she was tentatively interested in. At the end of the second page, in handwriting slightly different from the rest, as if she'd stopped and come back to it, Beatrice had written, "I want to say I'm glad it turned out the way it did. I was so afraid for you. I think I was more afraid than I was able to say at the time. I'm glad you found something real." Evelyn read that sentence 3 times. She wrote back the same day. She wrote about the garden and the schoolhouse curtains and the winter and Maisie's birthday and the cake with the uneven icing. She wrote about Caleb in the way you write about a person when you're still learning the language for them, carefully, with the sense that the words weren't quite large enough but were the best available. She wrote, "I didn't find it, Bea. I think it found me. I think sometimes the wrong road takes you to the right place, and the trick is to be paying attention when you get there, instead of being too focused on where you thought you were going." She sent the letter. She expected she would not hear back for a while because Beatrice was a slow correspondent when things were going well, and she was glad things were going well for her. The second winter was easier than the first, not because it was less harsh. If anything, the cold was more sustained, the snow deeper, but because they knew what they were doing now, the 3 of them. They had a winter between them already. They knew which problems came and in what order, and they had sorted out, without discussing it, who handled what and when. Maisie had gotten taller. She was 9, going on something more formidable, reading books well past her grade at school, still singing made-up words to songs she half knew, still bringing Evelyn interesting rocks with the regularity of someone who considered this a standing responsibility. The braids were her own now, mostly. She'd learned to do them herself, though she let Evelyn fix them on school mornings, and Evelyn did this without being asked. There was a rhythm to the household that had taken the better part of a year to build, and that felt now like something structural, part of the ranch. The way the walls were part of it, the way Clara's onions were part of the garden. One evening in December, with the snow coming down past the south window, and the stove running warm and Maisie asleep, and the house very quiet, Caleb put a cup of coffee in front of Evelyn and sat down across from her and said, "You all right?" She looked at him. It was the question he asked when he'd noticed something, not when he was making conversation. "I was thinking," she said. "About what?" She thought about how to say it. About the station platform, she said. About sitting on my trunk. She paused. I think about it sometimes. Not with regret, just with the strangeness of it. How close it all came to going differently. He was quiet for a moment. What would have gone differently? If you'd come into town an hour later, she said. If Maisie hadn't offered me the biscuit. If I'd taken the stage east when Pratt offered to pay for it. She looked at her coffee. Any one of those things. But you didn't, he said. I didn't, she agreed. Because you weren't going to sit on that platform and wait, he said. You got up and walked into town. I remember that. I'd already seen you from the feed store window before Maisie noticed. You were just sitting there, and then you stood up and walked. He paused. Most people in that situation would have gone to the station master and asked him to send a telegram for help. You walked into town like you were going to figure something out. She hadn't known he'd seen her before Maisie had. That landed somewhere specific. I didn't know what I was going to figure out, she said. I know, he said. That was the thing about it. She looked at him across the table, this man who noticed things quietly and said them later, when the time was right. Caleb, she said. Yeah. Thank you for coming into town when you did. He looked at her. Don't thank me for the timing, he said. Thank Maisie. She's the one who wanted feed that day. She smiled. He almost smiled back. The snow came down past the window and the stove did its work, and the house held the way it had learned to hold through whatever came at it. There is a thing that people say about broken starts, that they mean something was wrong from the beginning, that the fracture was always there, that some things simply cannot be made right. Evelyn had believed a version of this, in the worst of her first weeks in Mill Haven. She had thought that arriving abandoned, arriving wronged, arriving with nothing, meant she had come in too damaged for anything sound to be built from it. She understood now that this was wrong. Not naively wrong, not wrong the way wishful thinking is wrong. Wrong in the specific way that a theory is wrong when the evidence doesn't support it. The evidence of her life, assembled, the chicken coop latch, the schoolhouse curtains, the station records in Eli Croft's handwriting, the nail in the wall, the cake with the uneven icing, the onions coming up every spring, said something different. It said that broken starts were still starts. It said that what mattered was not the condition of your arrival, but what you did when you got to your feet. She had gotten to her feet. She had kept getting to her feet. That was not a virtue, exactly. She had not chosen it out of nobility. She had done it because the alternative was sitting on a trunk on a platform and waiting for something that was not coming, and she had never been capable of that. But the getting up had mattered. The walking into town had mattered, and the willingness to climb into a stranger's wagon and say, I know how to use a stove. That had mattered most of all, because it was the moment she had offered something real instead of waiting to receive something, and the whole life that followed had come from that. She did not think about Gerald Pratt very often. When she did, she thought of him the way she thought of bad weather, not with hate, not with particular feeling, just with the recognition that it had happened and that it had passed and that the ground was still there underneath, solid and workable. She thought more often about the woman who had put those onions in the ground 3 years before Evelyn arrived, about Clara Dawson, who had planted things she would not live to harvest, who had not known that someone else would come along and tend them. There was something in that worth sitting with, the idea that what you build and tend can outlast you, can matter to someone you'll never meet, can keep growing in ground you no longer walk. Evelyn intended to be that kind of person. Not perfect, not finished, not smooth, but the kind whose work held, the kind who put nails in walls and tended other people's onions and showed up for the truth even when it was inconvenient and said yes to the right question when it finally came. The kind who, when they arrived somewhere broken, made it theirs anyway. She was in the garden in early May, on her knees in the good dark soil, when Maisie came running out of the house calling her name. Not in distress, in the specific pitch of a child who has discovered something interesting and cannot wait. There's a letter, Maisie said, skidding to a stop at the garden edge. From Philadelphia, from your cousin. Evelyn sat back on her heels and took off her garden gloves. Bring it here. Maisie brought it and then stood beside her while she opened it, reading over her shoulder with the total absence of privacy consciousness that was one of her defining traits. Beatrice had written 4 pages this time. On the 3rd page, I think I might visit, if you'd have me. I want to see what Kansas looks like when it's real, and not just in someone's letters. Evelyn read it twice. She looked at the garden around her, the rows, the herbs along the edge, Clara's onions standing reliable as always in their corner. "Who's Beatrice?" Maisie asked. "My cousin," Evelyn said. "She might come visit." Maisie absorbed this. "Does she like animals?" "I don't know. I'll have to ask." "She should like animals," Maisie said firmly, the way she said most things. "Or she'll have trouble with the cat." Evelyn folded the letter. "The cat doesn't like anyone." "The cat likes you," Maisie said. "It sat on your foot last Tuesday." "It was cold," Evelyn said. "Still counts," Maisie said, and went back inside because she had delivered the letter and rendered her judgment, and that was all the garden required of her. Evelyn stayed on her knees in the soil for another minute. The morning was warm and clear, the sky the particular open blue that made Kansas sky different from any other sky she'd known. Bigger, somehow, or just more honestly itself, without anything to hide behind. Caleb was at the north fence. She could see him at the edge of her vision, moving along the line of posts, checking, fixing what needed fixing. He would do this, and then he would come in for the noon meal, and she would have it ready because she would have worked her timing around his without either of them having to say so, the way the days had arranged themselves now into a pattern that ran on a shared sense of what needed doing and when. She put her gloves back on and went back to the weeding. The onions grew. The sun moved across the Kansas sky the way it always had, indifferent and steady and entirely without opinion about what happened underneath it. And Evelyn Harper, who had arrived with 43 cents and a broken promise and sat on a trunk on a platform in a town she'd never heard of, who had fixed a chicken coop and faced a judge and hung blue curtains in a schoolhouse and put a dress on a nail put there by a child with a purple thumb, kept her hands in the good dark earth and kept working because the work was hers, and the land was hers, and the life was hers, and she had chosen all of it, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was exactly right.